Afternoon, I get to do it twice a meeting, so. Afternoon, everyone. Call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 8 of the House Common Standing Committee on Justice and Human Rights. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted earlier this year on September 23rd, the committee is meeting to continue its study on bail, sentencing, and the handling of repeat violent offenders. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the standing orders. Members who are attending in person, which is the majority of us in the room, and there's others that may be, particularly witnesses, remotely joining us using the Zoom application. Avant de continuer, j'aimerais encore répéter.
Before we continue, I'd like to remind all participants who are here in the room to take a look at the guidelines that are on the cards on the table. These measures are in place to prevent audio incidents and acoustic shocks and to protect the health and safety of all participants, including the interpreters. And you will see that there's also a QR code on this card which links to a short video.
A few more comments for the benefits of witnesses in particular, as the members have heard this instruction before and are mostly complying. Please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. Obviously, for those participating by video conference, click on the microphone icon to activate your mic, and please mute yourself when you're not speaking. For those on Zoom, at the bottom of your screen, and you're probably familiar with this, you can select the appropriate channel for interpretation, either floor, English, or French. And for those in the room, you can use the earpiece and select the desired channel accordingly. A brief reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. I won't impede the dynamic dialogue back and forth between witnesses and members, but if it gets to a point of respect, I will ask people to direct questions or answers through the chair. Pour les députés présents dans la salle, si vous souhaitez...
For members who are in the room, if you want to take the floor, please raise your hand. For people on Zoom, as I was saying, you can use the raise hand function, and the clerk to my left and myself will do our best to keep a speaking order, and would like to thank you for your patience and your understanding in this matter.
I want to welcome the first panel, and we have a number of people with us.
Monsieur le Président, est-ce que les tests...
Mr. Chair, have the sound tests been done? Do we have positive results? Yes, we have definitive results until we have assigned to the country, but the checks have been done. Thank you.
So on our first panel today, for the first hour, we have in her personal capacity, Kelly Sandberg, professor of Mount Royal University. Hi, Kelly. De l'Assemblée des Premières Nations, Terry Teegee.
From the Assembly of First Nations.
Le chef régional.
We have the regional chief from BC.
Kyrie Tristry, who's the directrice principale, principal director at the AFN. Mayor of Winnipeg, Scott Gillingham, mayor. Et de la Fédération canadienne des municipalités, Matt Gemmell, directeur général politique et affaires publiques. Hi, Matt. Remember the witnesses that they have 5 minutes for their opening statements, followed by questions. You don't have to do 5 minutes, but do keep it to that, followed by questions from the committee. That's it for the opening round. I think we'll jump. There's members. There's some eager members today wanting to ask you some questions. So if you have opening comments, please do so, and I'll leave it up to you to do that now. Thank you. We'll go in the order of presentation. So Kelly, maybe you first, and then we'll go to Scott or Kyrie if you have anything to add. Then sorry, Terry and Kyrie, then Scott and Matt. La parole est à vous, messieurs.
Mr. Chair, I'm Kelly Sundberg. I'm a professor at Mount Royal University in Calgary, Alberta. I hold a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science, Master's in Justice and Public Safety Leadership and Training, and a doctorate degree from Monash University in Australia in criminology. I also hold research positions at the University of Calgary, the University of Adelaide Faculty of Law, University of East London, and more recently, St. John's University in Queens, New York. I am a former CBSA officer for 15 years working in inland enforcement, and also worked here in Ottawa as a senior policy officer for some time during the early 2000s. My research and my scholarship focuses mostly on issues from street crime through to national and border security and the nexus between all of those components. with respect to my work in security and community resiliency, I represent Canada at the International Standard Organization for the committees regarding those two issues. So I did provide some notes because I knew as a professor I could talk for the next 10 hours, but giving 5 minutes, fairly limited. So I did provide notes that should be in your package that summarize a lot of the key points that I'll be making. But in all regards, I do see that in looking at the last 7 meetings, you know, it's quite clear that we already have some very good laws in place. The issue in my mind really comes down to how do we enforce those? And when we look at the debate and the concerns of Canadians with regards to high issues of reoffending or those who are on bail that do engage in subsequent criminal activity, breach their terms, this understandably does cause issue for Canadians. Nevertheless, I think it's important to note that the data shows that, in fact, we do put a lot of people into pretrial custody. Nevertheless, we do have some unfortunate incidents. With regards to the 3 areas that I would be open to speaking with the members, when we think of the public, it's really we need a lot of this is a communications challenge in my view, where we have a lot of narrative around the quote-unquote revolving door, and really what the issue is what's on the other side of that door. When they come out, where do they go? What resources do we have? To this end, and I'll finish it off because I know I only have 5 minutes, and I think I'm down to 4. You know, we have to consider bail and all issues in the context that it is the criminal justice system. And when we adjust one part of the system, what inevitably can happen is that there's misalignment or a lack of calibration in other sections. And when we're looking at major changes to a system, we have to consider the ramification on other parts of that system. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Over to Regional Chief TG.
First of all, I want to acknowledge the territory that I'm calling from, the Daket people, Claytli Tene. Thank you to the Standing Committee, Justice and Human Rights, for the opportunity to speak on this very critical matter. First of all, I want to be clear. We all want safer communities. We all grieve when we hear stories of violence, of lives cut short, and our families torn apart. But for First Nations, the crisis of the justice system is not new. It is the direct outcome of generations of systemic racism, colonization, and the state police system that have criminalized our people and eroded our rights. I won't get into the root causes of colonial and systemic roots. We all know the issues of colonization, the ongoing impacts of colonization, despite being only 5% of the population, we're nearly 30% of those that are incarcerated, and the need for upstream reform. As within bail reform and the current system, Section 515(1) of the Criminal Code of Canada affirms that individuals are presumed innocent until proven guilty. That liberty should not be restricted without cause. But that principle does not hold true for First Nations. In practice, First Nations people face a presumption of inherent guilt, not innocence. The so-called ladder principle, which requires judges to impose the least restrictive conditions, is often ignored when the accused is First Nations. Homelessness, poverty, trauma, addictions, and systemic discrimination make it harder for First Nations to meet bail conditions. Lacking a fixed address, surety, or access to treatment becomes grounds for denial, not for support. Gladue principles, which require courts to consider unique circumstances of Indigenous peoples, are often dismissed or inconsistently applied. Expert reports on trauma and mental health are sometimes disregarded entirely. The result? Denial of bail, longer pretrial detention, and greater pressure on First Nations accused to plead guilty simply to regain freedom, creating a cycle of criminalization that feeds overrepresentation. At the provincial level, this is evident. 80% of those in Ontario's jails are on remand. Awaiting trial, not convicted, jail has become a default holding space for people whose real challenges stem from poverty, mental illness, and substance abuse. Recent high-profile cases involving First Nations offenders reoffending while on bail have prompted public calls for harsher, tough-on-crime measures. These incidents must be examined carefully and in context. Broad punitive reforms risk worsening the overrepresentation of First Nations in custody rather than addressing the root causes. We know the underlying issues of trauma, poverty, inadequate housing, poor health, limited education and employment, and a lack of effective rehabilitation. These are the root causes that we must be focusing on, not political responses that further criminalize First Nations people. Certainly proposed changes by the Carney government, which have been brought forward on October 15th, introduce proposed reforms to bail, sentencing, and parole, including stricter rules of repeat offenders and tougher sentencing for crimes like auto theft, and sexual assault. We are deeply concerned about the government's proposed legislation to tighten bail, sentencing, and parole eligibility, announced without consultation with First Nations. These reforms threaten to erode the presumption of innocence and expand reverse onus provisions, forcing accused persons to prove they deserve bail. For First Nations, this is not new, sadly. We already know that we live under a de facto reverse onus system. These reforms would make it worse. While tragic cases of reoffending of rightly prompted concern, broad punitive reforms risk deepening inequities and will not address those root causes. The answer to violence is not harsher laws. It is rather healing, diversion, prevention, and addressing the social conditions that rise to harm. I must reiterate, the Assembly of First Nations, the AFN, are deeply concerned over the lack of consultation with First Nations leadership and the justice systems, and our justice systems. Certainly, I'll get to what needs to be done. I really think that perhaps, we must empower our First Nations governance to lead on rehabilitation, transfer ownership and control of healing lodges to First Nations institutions to ensure culturally appropriate, culturally grounded, community-based approaches to healing and reintegration. Reallocate resources to communities. Redirect federal correctional funding to First Nations governments and organizations, enabling them to design and deliver justice services and reflect their unique needs and strengths.
If you could just briefly sum up, the time is at 5 minutes.
I'll get to the last two. Advance First Nations-led justice reform. Collaborate with First Nations to co-develop a distinctions-based national Indigenous incarceration strategy. Implemented the 10 years since Spirit Matters recommendations and provide sustained funding. Diversion and restorative justice. Expand culturally appropriate diversion programs and restorative justice initiatives led by First Nations. What we're trying to get to is to the root cause. Rather than dealing with a symptom, deal with a disease. Thank you. Merci.
Thank you, Regional Chief. And members will have the opportunity to go deeper into your presentation if they so choose with their time, as well as ask Ms. Tristry questions too, if you share your time. Now over to Mayor Gillingham.
Chair Miller and members of Parliament, fellow witnesses, thank you for the invitation to be here today. Excuse me. I'm proud to serve as mayor of a city of 850,000 great people with a great history and great prospects, but Winnipeg also faces real challenges. Poverty has been concentrated in the same neighborhoods for over a century, so predators can easily target vulnerable people. Winnipeg is a strategic rail, road, and air hub, making it a convenient transshipment point for organized crime, trafficking of drugs, weapons, stolen goods, and people. So, for too many years, Winnipeg has also been a violent crime capital. With the right laws and the right strategies, I know that we can change that. I know because in the mid-2000s, Winnipeg was North America's auto theft capital. Governments, police, and criminologists worked together to match preventative measures with enforcement targeted at repeat offenders, and we slashed auto rates by 80%. Winnipeg's new Chief of Police, Gene Bowers, is leading the the police service to embrace that same kind of thinking. Winnipeg is a partner with Premier Canu's government on social and enforcement initiatives to prevent crime. But in the absence of bail reform, Winnipeg cannot do what we did for auto theft in the 2000s. In May 2023, at my request, Winnipeg Police relaunched a joint warrant unit with the RCMP to target the highest priority violent offenders. For 2 years, they have been making an arrest every day on average. But they're arresting and rearresting the same people. 4 to 5 violent offenders arrested by this unit were free on bail, parole, or probation. Almost 1 in 5 were arrested by this unit more than once. Frontline staff in healthcare, on transit, emergency services, and reach and arrest. So recently, I asked Chief Bowers to provide me with actual cases where repeat offenders were convicted of serious crime. Repeat offenders were convicted of serious crimes committed while on bail. On September the 9th, I pledged to release a weekly bulletin on these cases until effective legislation is put in place. So far, I've released 2 assaults on bail, 1 attempted homicide on bail, and 2 homicide on bail cases. In September alone, other bail tragedies unfolded in Winnipeg, including the mass stabbing at Hollowatta First Nation by a man released on bail from Winnipeg court, the sentencing of an offender stabbed by a man to death in a bus shelter last winter while on bail. We can do more in Winnipeg, and we will. But Parliament must offer Canadians decisive help. Parliament can legislate to put public safety at the foreground of bail decisions. Parliament can reform statutory release laws so that offenders are more likely to serve a full sentence for any serious breach of conditions. Parliament can support rehabilitation investments to better break the habit of crime. And you can ensure that an offender's prior history of disregard for release conditions is considered before awarding bail with new conditions. Finally, I'll note that a recent article in the Winnipeg newspaper argued that there was no clear statistical evidence that the bail system is broken. In one sense, I agree. Not enough data is collected and publicly reported. I can only offer a steady stream of individual, actual cases to prove convicted offenders are killing, wounding, or victimizing people while on bail. There's a national wrongful conviction registry, and governments rightly compensate the wrongfully convicted. But our justice system doesn't even acknowledge the moral possibility that releasing a habitual criminal to reoffend could be considered wrongful bail. We can't operate as if victims of preventable crimes by known offenders are just collateral damage to the fairness of our justice system. We need better data on crimes committed while on bail, and that data needs to be publicized. And we need more transparency to help enforce bail conditions. In conclusion, we've heard from the federal government the legislation, too much of what I'm asking for here is imminent, and if so, it can't come soon enough. I know I'm speaking with the support of my mayoral colleagues across Canada, certainly across Manitoba, including Mayor Jeff Fawcett of Brandon, Mayor Sherilyn Knox of Portage la Prairie, Councillor Kathy Valentino, the President of the Association of Manitoba Municipalities. Members of Parliament, we need your help to make Winnipeg a safer city. We need your help to make all communities across this great nation safer for everyone. Thank you.
For you, Matt.
Great, thanks, Chair Miller. Bonjour à tous et à tous. Thank
Hello, everyone.
you for the invitation to the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. And I want to thank all the members of the committee for prioritizing this study on this important topic. I know this issue is playing out at the local level in all of your committees. I also want to acknowledge that we have members of the committee who have been elected locally at the municipal level and who understand the realities of municipalities and municipal law enforcement. And I want to thank Mayor Gillingham for traveling here to Ottawa from Winnipeg to be here today. Mayor Gillingham also serves as the Vice Chair of FCM's Big City Mayor's Caucus. Across Canada, municipalities are seeing the same concerning pattern. Individuals with a history of violent offences are being released on bail and committing new offences shortly after. Police services report rearresting the same individuals again and again. Ce cycle exerce une pression énorme sur les ressources municipales. It diverts local police from other urgent calls, increases pressure on emergency responders, and stretches the capacity of limited community services. And ultimately, it leaves residents feeling less safe in their communities. And I want the committee to know that these concerns are being felt in communities across the country, large and small, from the GTA and Metro Vancouver to smaller communities like North Battleford, Saskatchewan, or Portage la Prairie, Manitoba. This issue is not isolated or regional, it's national in scope. Municipalities respect that bail is a constitutional right and that the justice system must uphold the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and the principle of judicial independence. And we also recognize, as we've heard today already, the historic overrepresentation of specific groups, including Indigenous peoples, in the criminal justice system. However, from the municipal perspective, it's clear that the current bail system and its application is not working as intended and is failing Canadians. FCM is recommending 5 steps to improve community safety outcomes. First, strengthen the criminal code for violent repeat offenders. Amendments to bail and sentencing provisions should make it harder for violent, high-risk repeat offenders to be released. FCM welcomes the federal government's plan to introduce bail reform legislation later this week, and we look forward to reviewing that. L'FCM souligne aussi que cette réforme.
We also underline that this reform should take into account the realities facing municipalities.
Changes must be paired with the funding, enforcement tools, and training needed to ensure consistent implementation across jurisdictions. The second step involves increased capacity for the justice system, as we've already heard today. Court backlogs and limited judicial resources increase the risk that bail decisions are made without full consideration of public safety. Expanding judicial and prosecutorial capacity is essential to ensure that bail hearings proceed in a timely way and that decisions are based on evidence and risk rather than on delay or default. Third, Canada needs better national data and information sharing. Public safety depends on the ability to track offenders across jurisdictions. A national program is needed to collect, analyze, and share bail-related data with relevant officials, including compliance rates and reoffending patterns, to ensure that individuals charged in one province are not reoffending in another and treated as first-time offenders. Fourth, we must improve bail enforcement practices. Enforcement of bail conditions varies widely across the country, which can lead to uneven results and weakens public confidence. FCM, following the recommendations of the National Police Federation, is calling for a national study to identify effective enforcement models and tools, and for the federal government to provide the guidance and resources needed to ensure these proven practices are adopted in communities of all sizes in all regions of the country. And lastly, as we've heard already today from one of the witnesses, we need to address the factors that drive repeat offending. We need to address the root causes. Many individuals who repeatedly come into contact with the justice system are often dealing with mental illness, addiction, or unstable housing. Targeted federal investments in mental health and addiction services, supportive housing, and community-based crime prevention initiatives, including Indigenous-led crime prevention initiatives, are needed to break this cycle while relieving pressure on police and emergency responders. So in closing, municipalities want to see bail reform improve safety in real terms. Strengthening the criminal code is critical, but it must be matched with increased resources for the justice system and frontline tools for our police officers to make these changes work in practice. Municipalities are ready to partner in this effort. Merci. Look forward to the discussion.
Thank you. We'll have, we're going to 5 on this panel, so we have a little over an hour and 5 minutes. We'll probably get at least well into, if not complete, the third round. I'll announce the first 2. And as before, it's 6 minutes for the first round, then 5 minutes for the second, with the exception of the Bloc Québécois that gets 2.5. We'll start off with MP Lawton, then MP Maloney, Monsieur Fortin, troisième, and then the second round, then 5 minutes and 2.5 for Monsieur Fortin goes Brock, Dillon, Fortin, Weber, and Latanzio. So we'll start off with you, Andrew.
Thank you to all of the witnesses for taking the time to be with us today. I'd like to start with you, Mayor Gillingham. You alluded to it in your opening remarks. Explain this bulletin you've had to start doing for repeat offenders, please.
Well, I've been sharing actual cases, historic cases, so as not to jeopardize any matters that would be currently before the courts. And so far, I've released 5 of them, and the information is taken, we're being assisted right now with the Winnipeg Police Service and information of historical cases. And so far, as I said a moment ago, of the 5 cases I've shared, they're all cases where people have breached their court orders and gone on to commit violent crime. One was, the first one I released was, the final charge that led to a conviction was a carjacking with a firearm, assault. That individual had been, had 24 violent offenses, prior offenses, and had breached court orders 12 times. Another individual convicted finally of homicide, convicted of 8 prior violent offenses with 9 failures to comply. So these are cases where individuals have been repeatedly granted bail, and while they're out on bail, they're committing more crime. So from my point of view as a mayor of Winnipeg, is we need to continue, and other mayors, to call for the kind of changes and changes that will prevent that from happening, to protect individuals, businesses, community members from that kind of repeat violence from individuals who have a history of disregarding their bail conditions. And so that is at the heart of what I'm hoping that we see changed in the upcoming legislation.
And you've been speaking in your comments specifically about repeat violent offenders. You mentioned one case in Manitoba, the Hollow Water Reservation. Someone who stabbed his sister, injured 7 others, was out on bail at the time of it. Just a truly horrific case. And there is also an issue with nonviolent offenders that are subject to the same revolving door bail system. I was hoping you could speak to the effect that has on public safety, on businesses. I know this is something where it's often not been spoken about by witnesses here, but it is a predictor of violent criminality. People that may be out on bail for repeat vandalism, arson, and then are arrested the next time for something violent. Is this something you're seeing in Winnipeg?
We are, and one of the cases I know that talked about recently was an individual who was involved in theft and was confronted by a security guard, and that turned violent immediately. A weapon was produced, and so what started as a theft turned out to be another violent incident. What happens, though, too, is that when members of my community are talking to me, they're losing faith in the justice system when they see the same individuals, either repeat violent offenders, out on the street committing more crime, or they see those involved in theft over and over again. And I said in my letter to Minister Fraser that was put together with myself and Mayors Knox of Portage Prairie, Mayor Fawcett of Brandon, Manitoba, and Kathy Valentino, the head of the Association of Manitoba Municipalities, we said to them to Minister Fraser, we can't ignore the small things, because the small things become the big things if left unchecked. Mm-hmm. And so I'm all for diversion. I'm absolutely for rehabilitation. But when there's violent incidents, we need to use all tools possible to separate the perpetrators from the potential victims, and those who would continue have a history of disregarding their court orders, who we think will go on, likely to, quite possibly, to repeat a violent offense. We've got to use whatever tools possible to separate those individuals from the public.
Thank you. Mr. Gemmell, you mentioned this is a national issue. Now, this tracks with what I've been hearing. There is no city or town or community that is unaffected by this in any province, northern, southern, French, English, large, small, urban, rural. You said very clearly it's a national problem. The Liberal members on this committee have been trying to put a lot of the blame on provincial governments, saying that our issues are really with provinces here. You're saying this is a national issue. You're saying there is federal legislation that is needed to solve this bail problem.
Yeah, thanks for the question.
Your mic.
Do I need to turn it on? It's on there. Thanks for the question. Certainly, we are seeing this issue as national in scope. FCM represents 2,100 municipal governments of all sizes in every province and territory, and we are hearing about this issue from members in communities of all sizes and in all regions. In terms of the responsibility, to address this, it's clearly a shared responsibility. There's a role for the federal government, for the provinces and territories, and on the policing side, clearly a role for municipalities. What municipalities are saying is local law enforcement have their hands tied. They're not able to address this issue without further changes to the criminal code and without further changes improving the capacity of the justice system at the provincial level. So there is a shared responsibility there, and we are looking for leadership from the federal government.
When you hear from municipalities, and they're, of course, dealing with police service boards, they're dealing with police chiefs, they're drawing a line between, largely in the conversations I've had, C-75 from a previous parliament on this, and that included the principle of restraint, this idea that offenders need to be released at the earliest opportunity under the least onerous conditions. Does the FCM support repealing the principle of restraint from the criminal code?
Yeah, FCM doesn't have a position on that specifically. Our focus has been on strengthening the criminal code to make it harder for repeat violent offenders to be released on bail. We don't think that's currently happening. There's evidence to suggest that that's not happening now, and that there are changes needed to make that more difficult. We also think that there's a role for the federal government to play in terms of gathering and compiling data and providing guidance to the provinces on best practices for making decisions on bail and monitoring bail conditions. It's a risk-based model, and the approach needs to be based on the best available evidence.
Thank you. Mr. Maloney, over to you, 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to all of our witnesses. I'm going to pick up on some of the things Mr. Lawton was talking about. There is this issue about federal, provincial, municipal jurisdiction. And one of you, if not all of you, alluded to it. There's too much finger pointing going on. Now, Mayor Gillingham, I'm going to start with you. I saw you on TV on the weekend, and I heard you talk about your bulletins as you have today. You've issued 5 bulletins. Am I correct in assuming that these 5 bulletins were used to highlight the really, really bad cases out there, and that's why we need the system reformed and we need some fixes to take place?
Yeah, they certainly highlight historic cases where tragic consequences to breaching court orders have been the outcome.
Okay, so thank you. Now, but that doesn't capture the entirety of the bail system or the entirety of the criminal justice system. What I also heard you say the other day, on Sunday, I believe, was that, and it's the same thing Mr. Gemmell just said, is that there's a requirement for coordination between all 3 levels of government. Mr. Lawton tried to suggest that the federal government's pointing fingers at the province. It's quite the contrary, in fact. What we're trying to do is have a reasoned, responsible discussion with all 3 levels of government to say, this is our part of the equation, that's your part of the equation, this is what I can do, this is what you need to do. And this is what takes me to the data point. Because right now, our job is, look, the federal government's responsibility is the criminal code. Let's face it, that's our part of the equation. The administration of the justice system is the province's responsibility. And Mayor, you gave an example of auto theft going down as a result of coordination and collecting data. Right now, we don't have that data. Mr. Gemmell, you suggested maybe the federal government plays a role in that. I'd like to know what you think the federal government can do in light of the fact, I'm from Ontario. The province of Ontario appoints the judges that do bail hearings, hires the Crown attorneys, builds the jails, etc. They're the ones in the possession of all of the information from which we can gather this data, which we don't have. So how do we get the provinces on board? Manitoba, I think, might be a good example. And Mr. Gemmell, I'd like you to suggest to me how you think the federal government can play a role in gathering that data.
I'm not sure if starting with me, sir. Okay. I think you heard from at least 3 of us here, the professor, Mr. Gemmell, myself, all agree that there's a part for each level of government to play. As mayor, I have a role to say my community is not safe enough because too many times we have repeat violent offenders breaching their court orders. But we all agree that there is a role for everyone to play, and I think that that if we need more investment, and we're making more investment as a city in police resources, and going upstream as well, we're making investments in young people, in crime prevention through investing in recreational services for young people in high needs area. But if we have to remove the choke points and synchronize, calibrate, I think was the word the professor used, which I agree with. If we need more investment in Crown resources by provinces, then that needs to happen. If we need more investment in rehabilitation while people are incarcerated, which I'm calling for, that needs to happen. For sure, every level of government needs to do their part, including municipalities, to make sure that our communities are safer, and that's the principle. We need justice for victims. We need safer communities. And we need the public across this nation to be confident once again that the justice system is working.
I think everybody in this room agrees with that thought. And, the negative rhetoric and the fear-mongering out there doesn't help that. Facts matter. And this alignment issue takes me to my next question. Professor Sundberg, you talked about a misalignment or a lack of collaboration. And this is exactly what we're talking, because if one level of government takes steps and the other two don't do their part, the system could run into a whole new set of problems. Is that what you meant by that?
Yes, and I think when we consider the number of independent players within this at the municipal level, and then going to the province and the territories, and then to the federal government, and then within the federal government, the different parts of our justice system, it becomes very difficult to adjust or apply goals or ambitions with regards to addressing the ills of our society at a national level with one approach. So it requires, in my view, and I would agree with the mayor and with the municipalities that the federal government does play a critical role. And I think that you raised a really important part where facts do matter. But I think one of the frustrations from the academic world, from municipal governments and from others, is the difficulty in getting coordinated statistics in a timely manner. Now, we have the capacity, and I agree with you. We have all these different sources of data, but
I'm going to interrupt you because I think we're in agreement here. But you said something else, and I want Mayor Gillingham to. You said we have good laws in place. The issue is enforcement.
Correct.
Mayor Gillingham, you said we need new laws. So if the law reform that's going to happen imminently, according to the Prime Minister's announcement the other day, does certain things, what happens if we don't have the data on the existing system? We don't have the data that Professor Sundberg's talking about right now, because I believe we have good laws in place right now too. This principle of restraint notion, nowhere in the criminal code does it say anywhere that somebody who's been convicted of 3 previous crimes, no matter how heinous they are, should be released. So without that data, we can't move forward in a positive way. So the federal government's doing its part. So what I'm asking you to do is to become vocal on the provincial component of this aspect, which I think is what Professor Sundberg is talking about.
I think that time's complete. Maybe another member will follow up and allow you to spend a few minutes on that, Kelly. But I do have to give it over to Monsieur Fortin. Réal, à toi 6 minutes, s'il te plaît.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to thank all of our witnesses for being with us today. Now, I've been listening, and I agree with what Mr. Maloney has been saying, and then Mr. Sundberg also touched upon on a point saying that we have good laws, good legislation, but how do we implement what we already have? So the question I'm asking myself is the following. Now, for a bail decision, as we speak, when a detained individual appears before a judge, they're presumed to be innocent, and the judge might release them on bail, except if there is a suspicion that they will not appear before the court the next time, or they represent a threat to public safety, or that it would cause other issues. Now, these criteria have been looked into by the Supreme Court and others, and there has always been this presumption that these criteria have been sufficient, but we're trying to maybe revise these conditions. So what needs to change in these criteria, in your opinion? Do these criteria suffice? If not, what other criteria should be added? Mr. Sundberg, if we can start with you, please.
This is an excellent question. And when we look at what's being proposed, I think we need to consider reverse onus specifically as being a tool that we use as a scalpel as opposed to a hammer. And when we use a scalpel, we need to have the individuals that are using that tool to have the information, the skills, the training, and the resources in order to make the best decisions. What I see has happened is that we have, and with respect to thinking of why are individuals breaching their bail? What are the big root causes? And we've all, I think we're all in agreement across all aspects. But the reality is that the biggest part is we have, and as the regional chief rightfully pointed out, we have a very, very significant population with indigenous population.
Je m'excuse de vous interrompre, M. Sandberg, mais ce que je comprends,
Sorry to interrupt, but the way the courts apply these criteria, is that the issue?
I do think that the application by the courts needs to be more surgical in its approach.
Merci. Et Monsieur Gillingham, s'il vous plaît, je me rends.
Mayor Gillingham, please, I'd like to hear what you think on the same question. So among these three criteria, do you think that some of them need to be changed, or do we need to add criteria, or are these sufficient, or is it what Mr. Sundberg has been saying, is it just a question of interpretation or enforcement by the courts?
I appreciate the question. My focus as mayor is to tell the facts of the story of what I'm seeing on my streets. And I would remind us all, I know everyone's aware of this, but every time we have a violent offender who breaches court orders, not only is there a threat to the public, there's a threat to our frontline police officers and other community service, emergency services members as well. So the specifics of what aspects of federal legislation would need to be tweaked or adjusted, that is, you know, the specific role, of course, of the parliamentarians, and then corresponding, you know, provincial elected officials as well. And I don't say that. I say that with respect. You know, what I'm telling you is what's happening on the streets of Winnipeg, and what I'm feeling from the public, what my police officers and police chief is saying, and you know, off record. Crown attorneys have told me, and even judges have told me. So I'm here to call for that.
Je m'excuse, Monsieur Gillingham, mais je comprends votre.
I do understand your message, Mayor Gillingham. Thank you. Mr. Gemmell, the same question, please.
Question, Monsieur Fortin. Our answer is that it's both and. I think we do need changes to the criminal code. FCM isn't recommending.
Quel changement?
FCM isn't recommending.
What changes, though?
Changes are we have two principles that we're advancing. The first is that changes to the criminal code will make it harder for violent repeat offenders to be released on bail.
Comment plus harder, je veux bien, là, mais comment? Il y a déjà trois critères.
There are already three criteria that seem to be sufficient for everyone until now, at least. I mean, we can change them. That's why we are here. But what are we changing in these criteria? For
a specific change. The second principle that we're advancing is that these are evidence-based decisions, both for changes to the criminal code and, to answer the second part of your question, there is an issue in the application of the current law, or if the law is changed. Judges need to have better data and better tools to be able to make evidence-based decisions to determine the risk of repeat offenses.
Merci, Monsieur Gemmell.
Thank you, Mr. Gemmell. Now, when you look at the statistics, 72% of the detained in our prisons are pending trial. So that only leaves 28% of the detained who have already been convicted. But in a regime where we have the presumption of innocence, that seems a bit problematic. What do you think about that, Mr. Sundberg?
I think that is a very good point, because we're talking about that roughly 30%. So when we consider, as we've been saying, what are some of the tangible changes we could make in the legislation? What are the touch points? I think we have to think of bail as not just a point in time, but a period of time. And that when we consider how bail is carried out, there has to be provisions to ensure, to compel monitoring, intelligence-led policing on that monitoring, and the resources, not just the enforcement resources, but the community resources. I think when we think of bail often, and this is where the frustration comes, we think of it as one point, you get bail. But bail really is a protracted process where we need to ensure the compliance, forcing and compelling compliance, monitoring compliance along the process. And if there's a breach in that compliance, there has to be a consequence. And I believe this is where we've fallen short, is thinking of it in a point in time as opposed to a process or a period.
Merci, M. Sundberg.
Thanks.
Thank you. Larry, 6 minutes. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Just when I thought that the Carney Liberal government could not be more out of touch on this particular study, we have Mr. Maloney, the current Liberal caucus chair and former parliamentary secretary to the Minister of Justice in the last Parliament, accuse Conservatives and other advocates of fear-mongering. Well, I couldn't see anything more out of touch than that when you've had, for the last 4 years, mayors such as you, Mr. Gillingham, premiers of every province and territory, police chiefs across the country, police association presidents, victim advocacy groups, all pleading and begging with this Liberal government to wake up to the reality on our streets that victims and Canadians are terrified. Those are the facts. They read and see every single day, example after example, of people committing violent crimes while out on bail. Mr. Maloney says facts matter. He needs to read the paper. He needs to follow what's happening on the media, because that's exactly what is happening. And then he has the audacity to say, we have good laws? If we had good laws, we wouldn't be in the situation we are in right now. We have a situation called principle of restraint, that regardless of the offense you commit, regardless of the number of releases you're on, regardless of your criminal record, which shows a history of breaching bail and a history of committing the same offense over and over again, this Liberal government directed and instructed judges to release the accused at the earliest opportunity on the least restrictive conditions.
Point of order,
Mr.
Chair. If Mr. Brock is going to make accusations and suggests he's relying on facts, I suggest he does it himself.
That's not a point of order, Mr. Chair.
The Liberal government has never instructed a judge, in my experience, ever.
Chair, that is not a point of order.
Yeah, look, obviously here, it may or may not be a point of order. You have 3 minutes left. I assume you have a question, because the principle of restraint obviously is not being applied to the line of questioning here. So just please get to it.
If we had good laws, we would not be here today studying this issue. If we had good laws, and we've heard from the Prime Minister, from Carney, from Justin Trudeau, we've heard from former justice ministers saying how sound our bail laws were, and that the whole concept of fear is simply in our heads. Former Justice Minister Arif Virani indicated that, a former Crown attorney as well. So if we had those laws, we wouldn't be hearing from this Liberal government now saying, we're finally waking up to the reality. We have been listening, and we're going to be introducing bail legislation sometime this week. Okay? We've been hearing that literally for the last 7 months. So I've identified the elephant in the room, and that's the principle of restraint. We have a bill already in the House of Commons tabled, the Jail Not Bail Act, which seeks at its principal core to replace the principle of restraint when it comes to repeat violent offending, and replacing that with the principle of protection and community safety. How do you anyone feel about that as addressing a tool to ensure that repeat violent offenders are detained in custody where they belong?
Just one of you, I guess, because there's only a minute and 20 seconds left.
I think that's a good point, and in my mind, this is when I talk about using a scalpel and taking evidence-based approaches. The issue with the concerns many Canadians have, when we look at one of the root causes is, especially with our First Nations Canadians, with our Indigenous Canadians who they're disproportionate within our system. Had we, and 10 years ago, we made a commitment as a nation to addressing the challenges that exist in these communities, had we followed through with more than 13 out of 90 some odd calls to action, had we seen and if we increased our investment into our First Nations communities, we wouldn't see the numbers and we wouldn't see the recidivism. We need to have, with any bail program, we do need to have a very calculated, evidence-based approach going into bail. But as I said, on that trajectory of bail, we need to have resources in place. And I believe that those resources do come from the federal government, that the federal government has an obligation, especially to our First Nations people, to ensure that they have the supports and that their communities are reaching the health and the vibrance and the opportunities. We're not seeing that to the same degree across the country. I know there are some good success stories that we've seen in Alberta with Oxford House and others, but in my mind, this is where we fall short in considering the process of bail and the monitoring and the enforcement while on monitoring.
Thank you, Mr. Sundberg. Ms. Dillon, 5 minutes.
My question will be for Mr. Sundberg. Right before you were cut off previously, you were speaking about bail being a protracted process. Can you please elaborate a little bit more on that?
So what I mean on this, and I think it ties in with what the mayor and the community association and the First Nations community would all agree, is that when we think of bail, it isn't there's the point when the decision to grant bail is made. But that is one point in the process. What I'm talking about is ensuring that the legislation clearly compels the compliance throughout the period on bail, that there's resources, both enforcement and social and health resources. We need to give individuals who rightfully are considered innocent until proven guilty, a hallmark of our justice system. So when we ensure that balance between public safety, I would suggest that there has to be very mindful inclusion within the legislation to monitor and to ensure supports are in place, and that when they're not in place or when they are breached, that there is a quick response. But to that point in the collaboration is that we don't have the resources. We see our municipal police services and probation officers that are understaffed, overworked, and with regards to the issues in our communities, where there is this belief in this obvious, I did an article in the Calgary Herald on this, with regards to what we call the dark figure of crime. There's a reported crime, but then there's the crime that occurs that isn't reported. And if we don't have the data, if we don't have the means of collecting that data, we can't make sound decisions. And again, this is the point of when you go into the bail system, I believe it must be done surgically. It must be done in a manner that ensures that we're getting it right. But we know the people involved. We already know who these people are and what they need, and we need to coordinate the resources, including enforcement has to be a central component to this. However, if we had followed through as a nation on the promises to our First People, I would hypothesize we would not be in the situation we are today. And at the end of this, and as I put in my notes, when we look at how drugs and addiction and the street level through to our borders, this is also fueling the problem. People do not engage. The majority of people who engage in crime and who get in trouble and who need to be on bail tend to be in that situation because of addiction and mental health, but largely addiction. And that is, again, that point of ensuring it's a system where we think the justice system works with the health system, with the education system, and all the others. If we tweak one wrong part, we can have an increased we can misalign in other areas. And I believe that's what we see, is we see an across-the-board misalignment within our justice system today.
Mr. Maloney was saying about there are no laws, bail laws right now in the criminal code that would favor a repeat offender coming out over and over and over again. If you could please, and your time had run out, I would like, if you could expand on that, please, before. No, before, previously.
Oh, thank you, and I won't waste the. You know, I think I'll phrase. I think our laws are good. I'll give them a B. I'll give them a B minus, and we need to move toward into the A range. And we're not there yet. We do have, I do believe this committee's work is very, very crucial because we have a significant issue. There is no denying that there are significant problems. But to solve problems cannot be based on rhetoric or ideology. It needs to be based on evidence. It needs to be based on the interests of both the victims of crime, but also considering the notion that those who are on bail are innocent until proven guilty, and that is a cornerstone. The Canadian Bar Association, I believe, as I note, did a very good job in addressing those concerns. But do we need reform? Yes, we do. Do we have a problem? We absolutely have a problem. How are we going to approach it? We need to approach it so that it's not a point in time we think of the entire process so that mayors don't have to have the resources of cities that aren't getting the federal funding they need to ensure both the supports and the services. And again, it comes down to following through on the promise we make to our First Nations people in this country, because that is, when you see that statistic, how many young Indigenous people are the ones in this system. We need to come together as a nation and follow through and ensure that we address these root causes. But it needs to be surgical. It can't be a sledgehammer. But a surgeon needs to have the tools and the training to do it right.
Thank you, Professor Sundberg. Réal, 2 minutes et demie, s'il te plaît.
He's incredible.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to our witnesses. Now, I wish I had more time, but we are quite limited in time. I just have a quick question because I only have 2 minutes. I was talking about the 3 criteria with which the Crown can keep someone in prison who hasn't been charged yet. What if there's a chance that they will not attend in court, if there's a protection or a safety of the public issue, or there's a confidence in the administration of justice issue. Now, in a repeat offending case, someone who has a past conviction, 1, 2, or 3, in their case, would it be possible to think about introducing a reverse onus measure? Now, in that case, you would ask the individual to prove that, well, there's no issue because I will attend court and I do not represent a safety issue, etc. So in your opinion, would that be a solution, not a complete solution, but maybe a partial solution to some of the issues that we are facing today?
Thank you for the question, Merci. One of the things that I'm calling for on behalf of other mayors is indeed that we ensure that the offender's prior history of disregard for release conditions is considered before awarding bail with new conditions. And also, a little further, Parliament can reform statutory release laws so that offenders are more likely to serve their full sentence for any breach of conditions. I mean, one of the aspects of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms is certainly to maintain the public's confidence in the justice system.
I am sorry, Mayor. I will have to cut you off because I have maybe a minute left. Mr. Sandberg, on the same question, would a reverse onus be useful?
Yes, it would. I agree with the mayor's position. I just want to add one important component to this. We need to think of non-citizens who fall into this process also. And I do think that when we consider bail, we do have to consider a number of factors. One of those is this individual a citizen, a permanent resident, or a visitor to our country? And that is one very big issue, but it's one that I think would be remiss as we talk of the elephant in the room. I think this is one component that is very important. But I would agree with the mayor's position 100%.
Thank you.
Merci. Ce serait important, mais en 30 secondes.
Thank you. That's all we could muster in 30 seconds. Thank you.
You're a professor of criminology, specializing in migration and border security. Under this Liberal government, transnational gangs are finding a home in Canada. Could you please tell us a little bit about how the Liberal government's border policies are responsible for bringing more drugs and gangs into Canada?
This is an excellent question, and thank you for asking it. one of the issues when we think of bail and how this nexus works, when we fail to screen those who come into our country either on temporary or permanent basis, we do not identify, when we don't have the resources to identify the possible reasonably foreseeable threat that some may pose, then we will have individuals in our country who will engage in criminality. When we have the very concerning level of organized crime that has taken root in our country from coast to coast, a lot of these, including cartels from Mexico and elsewhere, when these are the groups that feed on the individuals who are committing the offense. So when we think of where are the drugs coming in from that these individuals, these poor people that are engaged, we have to address organized crime.
Talking about border security, you're talking about the Liberal immigration policy that is responsible in part for these drugs and gangs coming into Canada.
Again, this is one system. So when we have individuals, when we think of criminality, when we have individuals who come to our country with the intent of engaging in criminal enterprise, they are, of course, going to target the most vulnerable in our society. And this is a tragedy for us. So there is a nexus between good immigration policy, good immigration enforcement, and public safety, as well as it relates to bail. Absolutely, and that's why I would urge the committee to consider the notion of who is getting bail, not just on the situation that got them there, but are they a citizen, are they a permanent resident, or are they a visitor? And that's an important consideration.
Thank you, Professor. I want to follow up on this because this is a study not just about bail, but sentencing as well.
Yes.
And I'm not sure if you're familiar with the fact that we're seeing sentencing decisions right now where judges factor in the residency or immigration status of the accused and are purposely lessening their sentences in order to help their immigration case. I find that to be outrageous.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I think it's very it's foolish and it's dangerous. It's unfair. It's unfair. At one point, I do believe we have to consider what does sovereignty mean? What does citizenship mean? And I believe that when we have individuals who come to our country, it is a privilege. We are a great nation. We have the vast majority of those who come abroad and live here are law-abiding, hard-working Canadians. But we have seen, because of lax border security, because of a lack of screening, we have seen a significant criminal element that has taken hold in our country, engaging in the importation and exportation, the export of drugs, and the threat to our communities.
Thank you, Dr. Sonberg. And specifically to follow up on my point, I'm not sure if you're familiar with MP Michelle Rempel's Bill 220, which actually seeks to prescribe that a court may not consider, a judge may not consider the immigration status of the accused on sentencing and potentially lessen their sentence in order to not compromise their immigration case. Is that something that you'd be willing to support?
You know, I think when we consider the role of non-citizens in our justice system, we do have to also consider that they have the right to be presumed innocent as well. To this point, though,
I'm sorry, we're talking about sentencing. That means
once they have been sentenced, we must ensure that non-citizens who are sentenced of crimes in our country, and the Immigration Refugee Protection Act has provisions in it already. The important part is that we enforce those positions. The crazy thing that I think is that there is no connection between the dockets in our courts at the city, in the cities across our country with the immigration department. So you could have individuals who are non-citizens who are sentenced that could fall through the cracks and remain in Canada.
Professor, I'm an immigrant to Canada. I've immigrated to Canada 30 years ago, and I believe this citizenship to be so wonderful. It's like winning the lottery. And if you have an accused that's been convicted for their sentence to be potentially compromised in order to further their immigration case, I find that to be astonishing and reprehensible.
Next
I
time.
thank you for
Time's
your
up. Thank you.
testimony.
Ms. Latanzio, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My questions will be directed for this part to Chief Tiggy. He's still on the line? Okay. So many of the challenges that are facing the Indigenous communities, as you highlighted in your opening remarks, was the over-incarceration and limited access to legal resources. And we know that those are managed provincially, Chief. So what changes to provincial practice or funding models would have the most immediate impact on improving the justice outcomes, according to you?
Well, a good example is here in British Columbia, we had a lot of resourcing from the provincial and federal government, and we have 16 justice centers in and around British Columbia that help and resource a number of our First Nations peoples and other people, matter of fact, to allow them to have a fair, representation in the court system. Now, all the comments made today, it's not... it's disappointing that I'm hearing everything that I'm hearing from this committee, because quite simply, you're talking about a lot of the issues in the context of your communities, that it's a federal, provincial, municipal issue. It's a First Nations issue too. These decisions that you're making in this room affect 634 communities and over 1 million people of First Nations descent. Now, you're making a decision here that are going to perhaps adversely affect our governance. And it's really important. I get it. I get it. The thing is that it's not just those 3 levels of government. It's First Nations governance that need to be involved in part of this solution. And in the comments of the professor, I couldn't agree more. I could not agree more about the lack of resourcing and funding over the many, many years. This could have been all avoided. Certainly 10 years from 2005 and 2015, when there was massive cuts to funding from the Conservative government. There was a lot of cuts in terms of the resources that many First Nations get. And I think further to that, what we need to see is more resourcing for mental health and addictions. And what these justice centers do in British Columbia is allow for provisions for diversion. We can't see this revolving door. I mean, we're going to get the same result again and again. And that's what these justice centers do, and help and support, and allow our First Nations to perhaps the resourcing and perhaps even a cultural perspective on how to get out of this really revolving door. And the other comment is that there's a direct relation. I know I've talked about, colonization. I talked about residential school. There is a direct relation of many of our young Indigenous peoples from the current child care provisions, from the child care, the foster care system directly to these jails. There's a direct relation, a direct pipeline to many of our people that are really vulnerable. And this is why we get over-incarceration rates, and we're seeing it. We need more data, but I guarantee you see it everywhere, and certainly a big part of this, and this is across spectrum, and it's not just First Nations, it's the issue of poverty. The ongoing issue of poverty, we're going to see this more and more. Access to homes in urban centers and back in First Nations communities is an ongoing issue. And, some of these issues we've seen historically in our communities, literally 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago. You're actually dealing with some of the issues that our people were actually dealing with. And I'm glad to, finally answer some of these questions, because what you're talking about is going to affect our people. You're making decisions on our behalf, and it's going to adversely affect us.
And speaking of data, Chief, 1 minute. Speaking of data, Chief, so how important is that the governments collect and share the disaggregated data to track whether reforms are making a real difference for Indigenous peoples and communities? And what do you suggest we do with the data that you may have on hand, or that these centers in BC may have on hand?
Well, we know for sure that, there's an over-incarceration rate. We make up 30% of the population. Bail reform, this is a real knee-jerk reaction. It's not going to solve the issue. There's going to be a lot of people on certainly denied bail. Perhaps more jails will be filled. What are we going to do? Become the next United States and build more jails? It's really becoming a holding place for many of our people. And there's a long waiting line on the justice system for many of our people, or anybody for that matter, to get their day in court. So really, when you're reacting and having this bail system, it's going to affect something else elsewhere. And it's really going to put more pressure on the justice system, which is overtaxed and overworked already. And I think you got to be really careful about what you're changing here. And I would rather try to resolve the disease rather than the symptom.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll have enough time for 3 more rounds of questions, starting with MP Gill, followed by MP Chang, and then Monsieur Fortin pour 2 minutes et demie, then we'll do the change over to the next round of witnesses. So, MP Gill, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming as witnesses. Mayor Gillingham, in your time representing Winnipeg, would you say the current bail system has failed cities like your own?
I got information from the police service just before I came to Ottawa, and I'll just share that to answer your question. In 2024, while the total crime in Winnipeg decreased, the number of crimes involving a breach of bail, probation, or other similar court-ordered increased for a 3rd year in a row. In 2024, there were 5,561 crimes involving a breach of bail, probation, or other similar court orders, and that's an increase of 9% over the previous year. In the first half of 2020, well, actually from January to August of 2025, that upward trend continued, increasing 50% over 2024. So the number of breaches, percentage of breaches is not going down. And I would say, again, what I highlighted is I campaigned on this, and when elected, we reestablished the partnership between the Winnipeg Police Service and the RCMP, who target repeat violent offenders in a joint arrest warrant unit. And on average, they've arrested over 800 people in just over 2 years. That's on average almost 1 arrest a day. But I'm hearing what other witnesses are saying as well. It's not just about catching people and putting them away and throwing away the key. Not at all. But it's also, about making those investments in rehabilitation. But right now, repeat violent offenders who are threatening our community need to come off our streets.
And how immediate is the need for action on bail reform, in your view?
Very immediate, and so I think that it speaks to the group of us who are here today as witnesses. It speaks to, I think, what the Prime Minister has announced just and signaled last week, and look forward to the legislation and the details of the legislation that are coming today, or this week, I should say.
And in your view, has the government hesitation to support conservative bail reform proposals put political interest ahead of public safety?
I'm sorry, I couldn't quite repeat that, please. Sorry.
In your view, has the government's hesitation to support conservative bail reform proposal put political interest ahead of public safety?
Well, I think, we do see that the government has announced that legislative changes are coming. Opposition has been calling for legislative changes. The public's been calling for legislative changes. So I think we're at this place now where we're having this discussion, which is really important. But I think, bear this in mind as well, is that too often, some of the most victimized are the most vulnerable in our community. We struggle with, as was said a moment ago by the professor, that we struggle with homelessness in our communities. We struggle with people that are struggling with addiction. Often it's those individuals in that population that is victimized by some of these individuals who continue to repeat. So my opening comment was, please, let's put public safety at the foreground, at the forefront of bail decisions.
Okay. So my next question for Mr. Jamel. How does the current bail system create burden for municipalities in terms of policing, victim support, and public safety?
Well, the burden falls in a number of areas. When we're not addressing the root causes, when we're not ensuring there's the supports people need. When we have people released on bail and then they're left to their own devices without monitoring, without supports in place, both enforcement. There needs to be an enforcement component, but it's that social support that needs to be in place. And when thinking of a key point, because there really are 4 levels of government that we're talking about here. And the resources are going to be different for an urban center or a suburban center than they are for a rural or northern community. When we think of the challenges we already have in ensuring the administration of justice in our rural communities and in our north, especially within First Nations communities, it is critical that we think of when someone goes through that trajectory of when they're released on bail, then or when they're on that trajectory, or when they're serving their sentence and they're serving their sentence in the community. We need to have healthy communities. We have to have supports for the cities, and it can't be done in the manner we're doing it. We've seen the disaster that resulted in the West Coast. We've seen some really, in my mind, dangerous laws and approaches that have been taken over the last while, and we have to pull that back. Okay. But it's one thing to have laws, it's a whole other thing to enforce them and administrate them.
Thank you. MP Chang, 5 minutes.
My first question will be directed to Chair TG and Ms. Chisteri. The federal government has strengthened bail provisions for repeat violent offenders while requiring judges to consider circumstances of Indigenous accused. What steps can the provinces and courts take to ensure that these commitments are implemented consistently and effectively?
Well, I think, one of the provisions that are provided by the court system is GLADU reports and understanding the context of First Nations perspective, and especially those First Nations, and there's very young ones that are caught within the system, and this revolving door, we're trying to stop this revolving door in regards to offer rehabilitation, perhaps even more so get out of gangs. And, it's... Mr. Sundberg has it right, that our most vulnerable are the ones that are being victimized in terms of why some of these issues are really happening. So I think there's definitely more resourcing to our court system to allow our First Nations to have fair representation, such as we have in British Columbia. That needs to be offered. Really, I think this policy, the way it stands, this bail provisions, and I suppose I really can't support without proper consultation. One of the things is, which I very much agree with Mr. Sundberg, is that we need better statistics. And certainly part of that are First Nations in regards who are caught in the system, and allow themselves to get either rehabilitated or really have some sort of prevention and diversion in terms of rehabilitation or offending. And that's a really important aspect and this doesn't solve it. Thank you.
Question will be direct to Ms. Gimel. In your engagement with local government, have you identified specific data sharing or communication challenges that limit the effectiveness of coordination between provincial and municipal enforcement agencies?
To the question, Mr. Cheng. One example, and you mentioned data and statistics earlier, would be gathering and sharing data on bail and on compliance with bail conditions between provincial agencies and law enforcement agencies. That's not currently happening the way it should be. I would draw a parallel perhaps for the committee between healthcare data and criminal justice data. We effectively have 13 systems, and they're not always talking to each other, and that's hard work to get them coordinated, but that's part of the work that is a reality in a country like Canada. And there's a role for the federal government to lead there, to gather and coordinate that data, so you don't have a situation where someone commits a crime in BC, travels across the border, commits another crime in Alberta, and a judge or a justice of the peace in Alberta isn't aware that they're out on bail. That simply can't be allowed.
Thank you. Dr. Sundberg, much of the responsibilities for bail supervision and enforcement rest with the provinces. From your perspective, do provincial systems currently have the capacity in terms of staffing, core resources, and supervision programs to effectively implement the recent bail reforms?
That's an excellent question. This is a challenge across our country where we look at the resourcing. We have a dearth of young people entering policing. There's more who are entering as peace officers, bylaw officers, and special constables. We need to really, this is an excellent question, because we need to, when I talk about the coordination and the calibration, one thing we need to look at is how can we institute maybe a tiered policing model where we have various law enforcement capacity. When we have limited number of police, limited number of law enforcement officers, there needs to be partnership and working together. And I do believe that provinces have the opportunity whereby they can start utilizing the services of not just the police or the parole or probation, but also others in the community, including community organizations and leadership. But that's a great point. We don't have enough bodies. That's what I was saying. When we have legislation, if we don't have the bodies, and if we don't have bodies that are well-resourced, trained, and equipped, then it's all but it's a moot point. We need to have, in order to operationalize the law, we need to have the people that do it, and we need to have the best people to do it. And within our criminal justice system, we've seen a significant decline in those who enter into enforcement or regulatory positions, and that is a big problem. Meaning, we now have to rethink at provincial levels how do we coordinate all of these enforcement functions we need so that we can achieve the outcomes that we really need. That is especially true for First Nations police. So when we think of, I think one thing Alberta is,
if you could just wrap it up.
Yeah, sure. It's just one really critical component, and when I look at these issues within Alberta, is the value and the importance of First Nations police and First Nations law enforcement. And that is one area that is grossly underfunded and resourced that I do think is incredibly important and in need of more service.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Chair on that last point, Mr. Sundberg. Monsieur Fortin, 2 minutes.
Mr. Fortin, 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Chair. Thank you to our witnesses once again. Now, so the criteria that we have aren't that bad, it turns out. And please correct me if I'm making a mistake. You talked about reverse onus for repeat offenders, which could be an interesting potential. We could maybe look into that. But what I will keep in mind from what you have said is that we have issues financing rehabilitation measures for people who have been convicted, and there are also prevention issues for the entirety of the society. Mayor Gillingham was talking about healthcare, dependency, addiction issues, so more funding would be welcome on that front, and rehabilitation as well. Now, because we're sending people in prison, but maybe we could hear from the Minister of Public Safety on that, but I'm not sure that there's a lot of money that's being invested for rehabilitating these people. They are kept in prison for a certain time, they come out, they reoffend. So maybe there isn't enough effort to rehabilitate these individuals. So what I'm understanding from your testimony is roughly this. I mean, let me know if I'm making a mistake, if I'm mistaken on that. And then what would you want to add? I have maybe a minute, so 20 seconds each. Mr. Sundberg, please.
Your interpretation is spot on. We do need to have the resources. When someone is on bail, when someone is released from a sentence into the community, we need to think of the community they're going into and the supports they have. We need to, the amount of money we spend on individuals from overdosing on the street, when you have a fire truck, an ambulance, the police, when you think of all of these, when we aggregate all the cost around addressing what we know to be a fairly small cohort of citizens. Unfortunately, a large percentage of that First Nations. We need to have that. We need to have those supports and resourcing.
Merci, Monsieur Sundberg.
Thank
Monsieur Gillingham.
Just a couple of quick comments. One, incarceration exists in part to separate people who pose a risk to society from the potential their victims. What I have heard, though, through stories, is people whose lives have been changed while they were incarcerated because they got access to the program and the rehabilitation they finally needed. And I have heard just recently at an event where a guy got up and told his story. He was arrested by police, Winnipeg police, again and again. Finally, he sat in jail one day and said, I've got a young son. I want to be a good dad. Grabbed hold of the rehabilitation, the program that was available to him, changed his life. He now has 3 kids. He's married. He has a full-time job for 3 years because while he was in prison, he got access to what he needed. And so I agree with the chief. I think, working with First Nations and Indigenous leadership is critical to making that progress. As he said, if statistically, that is absolutely what needed. So I think all parts of the system need to work.
Merci.
Thank you, Mayor Gillingham, and thank you to all the witnesses for the testimony today. We're done here for this hour, so again, with thanks from all members. I hope you have a great rest of the day. You can stay here and watch the next hour, but we'll suspend briefly just to rotate in the next group. So thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you.
deuxième heure.
We'll start the second hour.
Second panel of the day, we have, in their personal capacities, Ari Goldkin, a lawyer that is specialized in penal law, who is here by video conference. Chloé Leclerc, professeur, bonjour, de l'Université.
Chloé Leclerc from the University of Montreal, the International Center for Comparative Criminology.
Services Division of Brant, Penny McVicker, who's the Executive Director. Welcome, Ms. McVicker. Du Fonds d'Action et d'Éducation Juridique pour les Femmes.
Women's Legal Education and Action Fund, Kat Owens, Interim Legal Director.
That they each have 5 minutes from their opening statements. I will give you some reasonable time after the 5 minutes just to sum up and perhaps remind you, but please try to remain within those parameters. And I would, pour les fins du test de son.
And I know Mr. Fortin gives a lot of importance to the sound tests. I just want to let you know that they've been done.
Juste où j'annonçais le succès du test de son, on a été interrompu. Bon. Le deuxième test de son. So without further ado, we'll get off with the first round of witnesses in the order that I announced. So Ari Goldkin first, followed by Chloé Leclerc. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Ari Goldkind. I am a criminal defense lawyer in Canada and Toronto specifically, and an extraordinarily busy one. But I am also a citizen. More and more each day, those two titles clash. Why? Every Canadian has the right to feel safe in their community, in their homes, on their streets. Many, if not most, Canadians no longer do. That seems to be across the spectrum. Canadians are spending more money on ring cameras, Faraday bags, bollards, a word I never even knew what it was until a couple of years ago, to prevent their cars from being stolen and shipped off to far-off countries organized by rings. Their insurance skyrockets without them having ever had an accident. They worry about getting carjacked. You don't just have to be a Toronto Maple Leaf to have that happen to you. They worry about the perception that those in charge of their lives are soft on crime. They worry about being home invaded. They hear unfortunate clips from police departments saying, don't fight back, or just hand over your keys. They see ordinary homeowners being charged for defending their homes against home invaders. They ask, and I'm asked this question all the time, what has changed so drastically in Canada in the last decade or so? And what can be done about it? That is why I am sure we are all here. Many Canadians feel that their concerns are falling on deaf ears. They hear and feel that their bail system requires significant reform, that it is a revolving door. It used to be the case that maybe once a week, maybe every couple weeks, you'd read about somebody who committed a crime while out on bail. And you'd think, okay, that's an aberration. Maybe that's a unicorn. Well, now the unicorn rises every day. You can't open up a newspaper in a major city without seeing somebody that's on their second or third bail committing a crime, or somebody just released on parole or statutory release, going out and wreaking havoc, particularly on vulnerable members of the community. Many people in charge have never sat in a courtroom and watched the human toll that having a loved one raped, killed, or assaulted takes on a family. I spent my day today in a courtroom on 2 murder cases. The toll on the deceased's family is unbelievable. Why do I mention that? The criminal justice system has a balancing act to do. I represent accused people. I defend them. But I also, as a citizen, watch the toll that this is taking on my country. And rightly or wrongly, there is a perception amongst the public that the balance has shifted incrementally more in the last couple decades towards the accused, to the preference of rehabilitation over deterrence and separating out the truly dangerous from society. We read about all of these incidents that I mentioned. We see Doug Ford having to act as Batman at a Home Depot to stop theft. We watch people literally getting away with things. We have rural areas where 911 doesn't lead to the police being able to get there. When ordinary, average, law-abiding, and may I emphasize, tax-paying Canadians are harmed, they have the right to believe that their criminal justice system will respond accordingly, so that the same thing doesn't happen to their neighbor, to their friend, or to their colleague. But I, as a criminal defense lawyer, also say to you, every Canadian citizen has certain rights. Every Canadian has certain rights. That if they're arrested, they have a right not only to be presumed innocent, but a right to a reasonable bail, to be sentenced appropriately. Those things should never be taken away. But why are we here? Are we striking the right balance in this country? Are the reforms that have been talked about in the last week or two enough? Are we truly dealing with the dangerous amongst us in the right way? Is that a big number of people or a small number of people? Why are we afraid to touch the third rails of crime? How do you solve it without talking honestly about it? Our criminal code has a number of safeguards in it. The legislation is there. Parliament has spoken. Are the laws and the rules being applied properly at the bail stage, at the sentencing stage, and increasingly at the parole stage? The criminal code and the law and the charter is a living and breathing document. It has to keep up with the times. In my view, it is not. And a perfect example is the Youth Criminal Justice Act. It is not keeping up with changes in society. We have a principle.
Just wrap up, please.
Sure. We have a principle of restraint that is a very good thing. We're a country that we want to be proud of not only how we treat the best in our society, but the worst. To conclude, I have never understood why crime or punishment is a partisan issue. No criminal ever asks before they reoffend. They never ask their victim, who do you vote for? Public safety needs to be the goal, not being popular or being called useless or meaningless names. That should be the goal across the spectrum, and the only reason I am here today is to talk about what can make our system better.
In recent years, we have seen criminal issues being exploited for political gain, and that is precisely what I urge you to avoid today. So do not please legislate in response to high-profile cases or what you believe to be the expectations of the public and victims. The experience of past reforms in Canada and abroad clearly shows many things. First, extreme cases should not dictate the general rule, otherwise we end up with laws that are ill-suited to the majority of situations. Second, the tools to deny bail or impose a severe sentence already exist. If judges do not use them, it is because the facts of the case did not justify it at the time of the decision, not because they do not have the option to do so. If the reform you are considering proposes to limit the discretion of judges to ensure that they impose harsh sentences, be aware that all research shows that such policies have significant adverse effects. They clog the system by increasing the number of proceedings, create injustices and inequalities, and weaken the principle of individualized sentencing, which is one of the strengths of the Canadian model. Examples in Canada and internationally show that when the law is too restrictive, judicial actors will develop strategies to circumvent the rules and avoid decisions with which they are uncomfortable. As a result, the reform does not produce the expected results. Mr. Chair, apologies, Ms. Leclerc. Now, if the witness could maybe slow down a little bit. Thank you. So you want me to slow down a little bit? Okay. So there are examples in Canada and internationally that show that when the law is too restrictive, judicial actors will develop strategies, and this will have negative impacts because the actors will adopt strategies to circumvent the rules and avoid decisions with which they are uncomfortable. And the reform in that case does not produce the expected effects and often exacerbates problems and creates new ones. Finally, and most importantly, all scientific research leads to the same conclusion. harsh penalties do not lead to a reduction in crime. Not only do countries with very punitive policies not have lower crime rates, but the implementation of punitive policies does not lead to a decrease in crime. So a good example would be the war on drugs in the United States. It has contributed to filling American prisons, but has not reduced drug trafficking or consumption. Another important finding of the research is that the public and victims are not as vindictive as we think. When we take the time to listen to and carefully assess their expectations, we find that they are much more interested in an effective, consistent, and fair system than just in punishment. Research in victimology points in the same direction. Victims want above all to be heard, informed, and supported, and to ensure that there will be no more victims. So it is possible to meet their expectations with psychological support, information, and security measures such as electronic monitoring without necessarily increasing the severity of penalties. Is the speed okay now? Is it better? Public opinion is often shaped by a lack of understanding of the system and simplistic media representations. A good example is suspended imprisonment, which is often caricatured as a Netflix sentence, where the person serves their sentence at home in front of the television. In reality, it's a demanding and severe sentence, often experienced as more difficult than prison. Freedom is restricted, but more easily accessible. There are numerous conditions and constant responsibilities. While the severity of this punishment may be comparable to that of incarceration, it has the advantage of avoiding negative effects of prison, family breakdown, loss of employment, loss of housing, etc., while promoting accountability. The person must demonstrate their commitment in order to have their conditions relaxed. In addition, several studies confirm its effectiveness. We see this in Canada as well. According to Statistics Canada, individuals under community supervision with suspended sentences, for instance, reoffend at a rate of 28% compared to 53% for those who have served a prison sentence. So it's a severe and effective sentence, but it's underused, especially in our system, and this is particularly because of its negative image, which is a biased image most of the time. I would conclude by saying that your focus on violent recidivism is entirely justified and essential. Currently, the system devotes a lot of resources to managing offenses against the administration of justice, which is nearly 30% of cases before courts that have to do with the breach of conditions, and people detained awaiting trial. So these two categories make up more than half of the provincial population, up to 2/3 in some cases. So this volume management prevents the system from focusing on its primary mission. With risk tolerance decreasing over time, we have come to offer the most effective measures, such as suspended sentences and parole, to the most deserving individuals who present little risk and have good potential for social reintegration. On the other hand, those considered to be at higher risk are incarcerated in high-security institutions or offered few programs due to a lack of staff and resources. Ms. Leclerc, you have used up your time with questions. You may elaborate further.
Ms. McVicker and then Ms. Owens.
Thank you, Chair and committee members, for the opportunity to speak with you today on behalf of survivors of violence and the dedicated teams who support them. My name is Penny McVicker, and I am the Executive Director of Victim Services of Brant and past Chair of the Ontario Network of Victim Service Providers. Victim Services of Brant delivers the Victim Crisis Assistance Ontario program and the Victim Quick Response Program Plus, alongside 41 sister sites across the province. Victim Services of Brant, like our sister agencies across Ontario, stands ready to collaborate with justice partners to ensure that victim safety planning is embedded into bail decisions. We urge the committee to consider mechanisms that allow for timely communication with victims when bail conditions are set or changed, and to ensure that supports are in place to help survivors navigate the emotional and logistical challenges that often follow. These reforms are vital, and they provide us with an opportunity to ensure that victims are not left behind, but are fully integrated into the conversation. As we move forward with reforming bail practices, it is essential that we do so with a trauma-informed lens. one that recognizes the lived experience of survivors and prioritizes their safety, dignity, and voice. Every decision made within the justice system has a ripple effect on those who have already endured harm. Survivors deserve to feel protected, heard, and supported, not re-traumatized by a process that overlooks their needs. When we speak of bail reform, we must also speak of victim safety. At the heart of victim safety is timely bail notification. Without it, survivors remain at serious risk in the hours and days that follow an offender's release. So what exactly is bail notification? Simply put, it is informing victims as soon as possible when an offender is released on bail or when bail decisions are made. This timely notice allows victims to prepare, protect themselves, and access necessary support during their most vulnerable moments. Almost all perpetrators are eventually released back into the community. So the real question becomes not if release will happen, but how will we ensure victims are protected when it does. In Brant, where we operate an established bail notification program, I have seen firsthand how crucial this service is. Survivors of intimate partner violence, sexual assault, human trafficking, and hate crimes face immediate and serious dangers once offenders return to the community. Yet far too often in Canada, survivors do not receive timely or consistent notification and are left vulnerable to repeat harm or worse. The reality is that Ontario and Canada's current bail notification systems are fragmented and inconsistent. Some jurisdictions rely on police or court staff, but most victims receive no notification at all. More often than not, notifications happen only during business hours, leaving nights and weekends, sometimes when risk is often highest, largely uncovered. This creates dangerous inequities in victim safety based solely on location and timing. Victim services agencies in Ontario who deliver the Victim Crisis Assistance Program, including both Peel and Brant, operate 24/7, 365 days a year. Currently, Brant and Peel deliver trauma-informed, survivor-centered bail notification programs that combine real-time notification with safety planning and access to essential safety provisions through the Victim Quick Response Program. These include emergency support such as temporary housing, lock changes, personal alarms, transportation, and other critical tools that help keep survivors safe. Once notified of release, survivors are not left to piece together things on their own. We work with them immediately to plan proactively for their safety. That proactive planning reduces repeat calls for service to police, prevents missed opportunities for intervention, and increases survivor cooperation and investigations. In short, timely bail notification strengthens both community safety and the justice system as a whole. Peel's bail notification program stands as Ontario's longest-running model with over 40 years of proven success. Brant has effectively operated a similar model on a smaller scale for over 25 years. Together, these programs clearly demonstrate that timely, consistent notification saves lives and leads to better outcomes for survivors, police, and communities. At present, these programs are not funded by the government, but rely on unstable fundraising dollars for them to operate in their communities. Therefore, we, the Ontario Network of Victim Service Providers, recommend that the federal government establish a mandated province-wide bail notification and advocacy program through Victim Crisis Assistance Ontario agencies. Building on the long-standing success of Peel and Brant, this would be an Ontario-made pilot, a program developed, tested, and proven here that could serve as a nation-building project. By embedding this work within VCO agencies, we ensure consistent, trauma-informed, and survivor-centered service delivery across the province. Such a program would not only strengthen public safety in Ontario, but also create a clear network for national adoption, setting the standard for victim safety across Canada. Finally, for this program to succeed, it must be fully funded. Funding must consider caseload, geography, community size, and risk factors that ensure equitable access for all victims. Every victim in Canada has the right to timely notification and the safety support they need, regardless of where they live.
Thank you, Ms. McPherson.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Owens.
Good evening. So my name is Kat Owens. I am a lawyer and the interim legal director of the Women's Legal Education and Action Fund, also known as LEAF for short. And I'm grateful to be joining you here today on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people. As you may know, LEAF is a national charitable organization that advances equality for women, girls, trans, and non-binary people throughout Canada. And we do this through litigation, law reform, and public legal education. LEAF works with and on behalf of women and gender diverse people who have faced gender-based violence, intimate partner violence, and criminalization. And I will be clear, gender-based violence in this country is an epidemic, and we absolutely need to do more to end that epidemic. As an organization, we support measures that will meaningfully address gender-based violence and that will make survivors of intimate partner violence safer. We'll also acknowledge that there are genuine public safety and trust concerns with how the criminal legal system operates. At the same time, making bail harder to get and increasing sentencing harshness will not solve gender-based violence in this country. Instead, these changes will increase the criminalization of marginalized communities, including women and gender diverse people within those communities. So I'll focus first on those effects, and then I'll move on to highlight some of the reforms that we need to improve public safety and end the gender-based violence epidemic in this country. So as you've heard from people who work directly in and who study Canada's bail system, it is overwhelmed. People in pretrial custody face appalling conditions. They face lengthy lockdowns, a lack of rehabilitative programming or mental health supports, as well as serious health and safety risks. And the consequences of this for women and gender diverse people in Canada truly cannot be understated. First, and at its most extreme, people in these conditions are dying. In 2023, for example, Sarah Rose Denny, a young Mi'kmaq mother from the East Coast, repeatedly asked for access to health care in a provincial jail. And she was denied that care and died days later of double pneumonia. And it's not just those extreme cases. When we remove an individual from the broader community, you may have an improvement of short-term public safety. But what we see is that when that person is released back into the community, you see longer-term negative public safety outcomes. Even short amounts of time in jail can have devastating consequences. These include adverse mental health outcomes, loss of income, employment, custody of children, and housing. And this affects women and gender diverse people who are themselves detained, of course. It also affects those who have family members detained, who then lose income, lose access to housing, lose the supports that they need. And when we consider increasing sentencing harshness, it's really important to remember that individuals who are convicted of crimes are also often survivors of gender-based violence. People who are incarcerated, especially Black and Indigenous women, are more likely to have experienced intimate partner violence, and they are more likely to face criminalization by the state. And so when we make sentences harsher, we often end up hurting the people we set out trying to help in the first place. Take, for example, the case of Cheyenne Sharma, which many of you may be familiar with as it went to the Supreme Court of Canada. Ms. Sharma was a young Indigenous woman, a survivor, an intergenerational survivor of the residential school system, a survivor of sexual violence, and a single mother. She was facing the possibility of eviction from her home, and so she decided to act as a drug courier, and she brought cocaine into Canada. Strict sentencing laws in place at the time meant that this woman, with a young child who pleaded guilty, had no criminal record, and was facing intimate partner abuse, was ineligible for a conditional sentence and had to be sent to jail. And I would just ask, what is the benefit to society of sending someone like Ms. Sharma to jail? We need reforms to the criminal legal system. I agree with that. LEAF agrees with that. But they need to be grounded in evidence. We need an independent external evaluation of Canada's bail system. We need reforms that disrupt the larger relationship between incarceration, mental health, addiction, discrimination, poverty, and social disadvantage. When it comes to gender-based violence, this needs to be a team effort from all levels of government, federal, provincial, territorial, and Indigenous, to take a proactive approach focused on prevention that looks at root causes. We have ideas including creating an independent gender-based violence commissioner, exploring restorative and transformative justice models, and properly funding the National Action Plan on Gender-Based Violence.
Ms. Owens, just briefly.
Thank you for your time. I look forward to your questions.
That's very brief. Wish other witnesses took that lead. I will announce the first two rounds. I think witnesses are familiar, members are familiar with the time slots, but I'll remind them when I brought out their name. But just briefly, the order and the roster is MP Brock, then Chang Fortin, followed by Beber, Latanzio, Fortin, Lawton, and Dillon. I'll point to you individually, but that's the first two rounds, and we'll probably get well into the third, if not complete. So over to you, MP Brock. 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and I'd like to take the opportunity of thanking all our witnesses for your participation today. This is a very important study. The country is in desperate need of some reform in this particular area, and victims certainly are asking for this. So I do thank you for your participation. I'm going to start with you, Ms. McVicker. You and I have had a professional relationship in the past. It's good to see you again. You've seen violent repeat offenders walk free under conditions that are supposed to protect victims, such as no contact orders, curfews, weapons bans. In your experience, how often are those conditions actually enforced? And isn't it fair to say that for many victims, bail conditions have become meaningless pieces of paper?
I can say, okay. All right. I just wanted to give you an example of something that we dealt with within the last week in my office. We contact victims prior to bail court. We talk to them about what their safety concerns are if the offender is released. We get that information and we pass it on to the Crown Attorney. And they use that as part of the conditions that they use to set up the bail conditions. But it also gives us an opportunity to work with the client, to do some safety planning, to do some needs assessment, and to see what we can do to help that victim to keep them safer should that offender be released. Just a couple of weeks ago, we had a victim that we had done all those things for. We knew she needed a lock change. We got a locksmith out, got the locks changed. We knew that she needed some web cameras and things like that for safety, as well as some other safety supports being put in place. We call the victims immediately upon release when we know that the accused is being released. We were on the phone with the victim. She was able to watch on her phone the web cameras that were out in front of her house and see the offender walking up her front steps. She was terrified, that's to say the least. We kept her on the phone. We contacted the police. We made sure that they were on their way. The offender left and went down around the corner, which she was also able to see from her web cameras. The police got there. She was able to provide information on where he had gone, and they were able to rearrest him immediately. So we see this. Like it might not happen as immediate as it did in this situation, but it happens a lot that the offenders think that victims don't know what the conditions of release are, think that they can go back home, they think that they can just walk in the door and say, I'm back, and...
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. McVicker. I'm going to move on. My time is very limited.
Yep.
Your team has supported victims who've seen the same names, the same faces, cycling through the system over and over again. What does this do to community trust, particularly with the victim-centric position with the trust issue, when these violent offenders are arrested simply within hours, if not minutes, of committing the actual offense?
I would say it's hard on victims. They lose some confidence in the system. They lose confidence in what the police can do to help them, what the courts can do to help keep them safe. It's very. Sometimes they stop reporting because they're like, "What's the point?"
Right. the Liberal government keeps saying its bail reforms in the past and upcoming this particular week will strike the right balance between exercising the constitutional rights or upholding the constitutional rights of the accused, while at the same time ensuring that victim safety and community safety is paramount. But from where you sit in the capacity as the executive director, with victims who have been re-traumatized over and over again, afraid to leave their homes, do you see any balance at all with the current government approach, or are victims simply the ones paying the price for a system that simply puts offenders first?
I think the reality is that, as I said before, all offenders are going to get released at some point, whether it's, the next day or whether it's 6 months down the road or a couple years down the road. What we need to be looking at is how do we make victims safe when those offenders are released? And I don't think that we have that in place at this point in time. There's no effective, we have a Canadian Victims' Bill of Rights.
And I want to talk to you about that, so
Okay.
that's a good segue. I've reviewed the current version of the Canadian Victim Bill of Rights. I see no provision in there regarding absolute bail notification. Do you feel that's a deficiency that needs to be addressed by the federal government?
I think that's a major deficiency. Victim notification needs to be enshrined in the Canadian Bill of Rights. This is not only about fairness, but about building a justice system that protects victims as much as it holds offenders accountable. We have such, it says in the Victims' Bill of Rights that victims are entitled to notification, but that is viewed differently by police services and jurisdictions all across Canada. There's no consistent process for victims to get information, to be provided timely bail notification, to be provided the information that they need to keep themselves safe.
What about bail variations? Your thoughts?
There's about 15 seconds.
Well,
Just
those are really bail variances. We have victims asking from day one because they're afraid or their family's being torn apart or they don't know what to do. That's part of what we do is we help them to figure out where they can go to get help and what next steps are for those victims. Oftentimes bail variances lead to re-victimization, but oftentimes victims are inviting the offenders back in as well. So
Thank you.
Yeah.
Ms. McVicker, wait 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In my conversation with my constituents in Burnaby, BC, I often hear deep concern for public safety. People want to be safe at their homes. I share that concern, but as a lawyer, I also know that lasting safety depends on a justice system that is fair, balanced, and guided by evidence rather than emotion. Each of you brings a distinct perspective to this conversation, so thank you. Ms. Owens, LEAF has highlighted that broad reverse honest provisions can disproportionately impact women and marginalized groups. So what safeguards should the government consider to ensure that bail reforms remain both effective and equitable?
Thank you very much for the question. I think one of the things that's important to always consider when making changes to the criminal legal system is who are the communities that are likely to be most affected by these changes. We think about the terrible cases that happen, the emotional cases, and they are awful, but we don't think about the everyday work of bail systems. And so I think taking discretion away from judges, putting increased burden on accused people is going to harm members of marginalized communities the most, and that's something we need to keep in mind.
Thank you. How can the federal and provincial government better incorporate gender-based and equality analysis when designing or reviewing bail and sentencing policies?
Thank you very much for the question. I would say two things. The first, I think, is to speak to the communities who are affected and to the people who work with them. Studies like this are very helpful, but as are proactively seeking input from those groups. And the second, I think, would be to improve the collection of evidence so we know who is it that's going through the bail system, who's being detained, who's represented, who needs legal aid, so that we can make evidence-based decisions on bail reform.
Thank you very much. Mr. Goldkind, drawing on your experience in the courtroom, what measures should be taken to strengthen enforcement on bail breaches without compromising fairness or creating additional bail lock in provincial courts?
Well, thank you for that question. That's something I deal with every day. One of the witnesses just talked about how that's a huge part of the criminal justice system, 20 to 30%. They're called fails to comply or breaches. Two things I'd say jump out to me. One, I don't think anybody ever talks about, so we'll leave that for a second. The first is there's no way that police can go knock on every door. But we have a problem where, again, one of your witnesses said that when they get their bail paper or their promise to appear or undertaking, it's not worth the paper it's written on. They're out. They're happy to be out. They're told they're on curfew. They're out past curfew. They're out on house arrest, and they're out and about with their friends and maybe committing more crimes. The part that's never talked about is the role of a surety in Canada. Most people on this panel have probably watched a movie where there's a bail bondsman or Midnight Run where you put money down, and if you don't come to court, you don't get it. In Canada, it's very different. I don't think we have a robust enough system, and it's not really a juicy talking point, where most people who get bail at a bail hearing have to have sureties come and say, we're going to supervise that person. That's how somebody gets bail in Canada, particularly on the serious kinds of crimes that I think we're all here for today. I don't think we're here for shoplifting necessarily. So when you have mom and dad come to court and say, I'm going to watch my child and make sure that he abides by his curfew or his house arrest, and that child is out with the sureties knowing that the child or the person on bail is out, violating that bail, and they don't call the police, most people here would be surprised to know that there's very little recourse against the surety. If there was a public perception that if you come to court and say, I'm going to be the person watching them in the community, and if that person screws up, the government's going to come after you in what's called estreatment court, I think that would go a long way to helping people comply with their bail, because the people who made the promise to watch them actually know there's a significant financial penalty if they don't watch them.
Thank you. And much of the responsibilities for enforcement falls on provincial police and courts. How could better coordination or data sharing across jurisdictions improve both public safety and confidence in bail process?
If I think I understand your question correctly, and I can't know that I do fully, is that you want to have sort of a centralized system, which we do. We have CPIC, we have onboard computers in police vehicles, for example. I know there's a movement in many cities to have bail compliance units. I think that's probably a term very familiar to you. But there's only so many police officers you can take off frontline duty to go do compliance checks. I think one of the witnesses talked about door knocking and that sort of thing. One of the things that you see courts very loath to impose are geographic restrictions. In other words, somebody charged, for example, in Kitchener-Waterloo, remain in Kitchener-Waterloo. Forget the passport. Most people aren't leaving the country. But at the end of the day, for truly dangerous people, which is, I think, what we all want to focus on, I think that's probably something that's bipartisan or nonpartisan. For truly dangerous people, I think there has to be more notice to the public about that person being on bail or not, or the public understanding that that person has got bail. There's a part of it that's a different part of the question that I think I'll leave just on time about what I would recommend, but there just seems to me to be a problem in the system with the number of breaches and people not taking their bail seriously, and the people who signed those bail having no recourse for it.
Thank you.
That's it. Monsieur Fortin, à vous pour 6 minutes.
Mr. Fortin, you have the floor for 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Goldkind's introductory remarks were very interesting, but I will start with Ms. Leclerc. In your testimony, there were elements that I appreciated a lot. You referred to some statistics, and I took some notes. You talked about more severe sentencing, not reducing crimes, and then Netflix sentences are harder to on the individual in some instances. Do you have documents or statistics on those that you can provide to us? Well, the reference I made was to a report from Statistics Canada on repeat offenders. I mean, I'm not going to spend too much time on that, but you could send it to us, right? Okay, thank you. Same for repeat offenders. I think you were saying that it's not tracked all in the same manner. So if you have documents on those elements, if you could send it to us via our clerk, that would be much appreciated. Having said that, Ms. Leclerc, we have had numerous panels and witnesses before, and people are asking that we should be harsher when it comes to bail and how these processes are handled. Now, I tend to agree with this sentiment, this feeling, because it's shocking to see someone who's out committing crimes, but they're a repeat offender with criminal history. There are numerous examples, but a woman was killed, for instance, by her husband who was at their fifth or sixth criminal offense. So we seem to be dealing with a very significant problem. There are 3 criteria as we speak for a judge to decision on bail. Now, they will need to make sure that the person will attend in court. They will need to make sure that this doesn't violate public safety. I mean, this individual shouldn't go out killing individuals. And then it should not bring the administration of justice into disrepute when it comes to the allegations they are facing. So these criteria have been looked into by the Supreme Court at one point, but we seem to be satisfied with these criteria, but we have high-level cases as well in the media, and there are demands from people, and our work as legislators, our lawmakers, is to answer these requests. So what do you think about these criteria? Are they sufficient? If not, what criteria should we add, or what changes should we make? I will have other questions. I'm not sure that I agree with the point you made about public opinion, because when you ask people what they think about the courts, 70% will tell you, well, courts are not harsh enough, sentencing should be harsher. But when you ask them to make decisions to know what they would do with a specific individual, they end up siding, as it were, on less severe sentences. So I think we need to be careful when we talk about the public perception. So this will. So on the second point, what do you think about the current criteria? Are they sufficient or not? Well, we've never had this much pretrial detention. I apologize for interrupting once again, but what do you think about the criteria? Because we need to make a decision on those. Well, even if the criteria remain the same, it's a question of interpretation at court, and there might be popular or political pressure. So, in my opinion, the issue is not with the criteria that we have. So the criteria are sufficient, you're saying. So in repeat offenders, in their cases, if someone's before a court for a second time or third time, now some people are saying that we could introduce reverse onus at that point in time. So rather than having the Crown, that has to prove that the accused will probably not appear in court the next time, and that this will put safety of the public in danger, and then the issue with bringing the administration of justice into disrepute. Now, for an individual who is a repeat offender, should it be on them to demonstrate that they are not a threat to public safety, that they will attend court, and that this will not bring administration of justice into disrepute? So this reverse onus concept, what do you think about that? Would this be a good idea or not for repeat offenders specifically? I think the question we should be asking ourselves is, the option is already there. Keeping someone behind bars as they're pending trial, we already have that option. Courts don't seem to be having a difficulty doing that because we've never had such high numbers. So I think the issue is not to know whether or not we should reverse the onus. I have maybe 20 seconds left. The money that we're investing in healthcare, addictions, rehabilitation, is that sufficient, or do we need interventions at that front? Yes, we need interventions. And if you want to work on people who represent a certain risk, maybe you can also focus on other populations. Letting them go, in what sense? I mean, maybe investing a little less on individuals who are breaching their conditions, or whether it be bail or parole conditions. People who breach these conditions, they have behavior that is not necessarily illegal, but they might drink, etc. And this is not necessarily illegal behavior. So maybe we should focus less on these cases, and that way we would be able to invest more elsewhere. Thank you, Mr. Leclerc.
Welcome, Mr.
Sorry,
Goldkind.
Roman, just 5.
Thank you.
Not 6 yet.
Mr. Goldkind, gun violence in Toronto is out of control. Passed in 2019, Liberal Bill C-75 prescribes the principle of restraint. The Department of Justice's own website says that the principle of restraint is intended to ensure that release at the earliest opportunity is favored over detention. Basically, holding an accused pending trial is an exception now. Could you please tell us if the Liberal bail reform resulted in more gun violence or less gun violence on the streets of Toronto, and why?
Thank you for your kind words. I don't think anybody can answer cause and effect. I think that would be disingenuous. But is there a correlation? Have we watched the numbers go up in the last 5 to 10 years? There's no question about that. There is a perception of soft on crime. There is a perception of a criminal justice system that doesn't properly punish. I heard the word harsh used just a moment ago in the previous answer. Are we sentencing too harshly or not? Harsh is a word that's a pejorative. It almost suggests something mean or mean-spirited or unfair. I tend to take the view, is the sentence appropriate? Is it responsive to the needs of the community? So while restraint is not new, it's from the 1970s. I know you know that, and the 2019 legislation just codified it. There should be much harder questions asked. So my end to my answer on the principle of restraint is that's a good thing, that the system tries to treat people in the most restrained way possible. But that should be perhaps a first-time offender, maybe a second-time offender, maybe somebody who hasn't committed a serious crime of violence against a vulnerable woman. But when you apply the principle of restraint to everybody, sort of like ketchup, you're really taking away from the meaning of the term. So am I happy as a defense lawyer and as a citizen that we try and use restraint? Yes, that's noble. But there certainly should be times where somebody has, by their own act or deed, taken away that focus.
Thank you, Mr. Goldkind. The City of Toronto is falling victim to gang violence. One thing that stands out is that so many of the offenders involved in these gangs are under 18 years old. Of course, if a teenager breaks into a vending machine, we don't want them part of the correctional system. But I submit to you that the Youth Criminal Justice Act does no longer provide enough deterrence to for youth involved in gangs or even committing some of the most serious crimes on our street. What do you think about that?
The Youth Criminal Justice Act provides no deterrence. I think anybody who says differently is gilding the lily. The Youth Criminal Justice Act, when it was created many decades ago, was about two kids arguing over an iPod. Now, notice I said iPod, not iPhone. It used to be that you'd open up the newspaper maybe once a week and see some 17-year-old or 16-year-old who did something stupid. They get anonymity. We never need to know who they are. Go open up a local newspaper of any city now, and you'll watch 14, 15, 16-year-olds charged with serious and heinous violent crimes. They are going to be sentenced as a youth. In my view, again, to keep the answer short given time, you can't have a Youth Criminal Justice Act that doesn't change with the times. Canada has changed. Youth violence has changed. A 12-year-old is not a 17-year-old, and they should be treated very differently in different tranches, if I could use that term.
Thank you. I want to talk about sentencing and specifically parole. Offenders are eligible for full parole after serving only 1/3 of the sentence. Now, we know some of the basic principles of sentencing: deterrence, community safety, and rehabilitation, but it almost seems as if there's too much emphasis on rehabilitation that doesn't necessarily work. I've heard you talk about Kevin Kohler in Waterloo. A couple of weeks ago, a man described as a ticking time bomb who was out on the street again after choking a number of people to death over a period of multiple years. Seems crazy to me that we now essentially favor rehabilitation alone.
Well, he killed somebody in a car, including a police officer, then he choked a woman to death. So talk about vulnerable people within an intimate partner violence. Parliament, where you are sitting, literally makes that a much more serious crime. Here's what I've never been able to get my head around, even as a criminal defense lawyer, and I know this is sacrilege to say. You don't get out at a third because of good behavior or showing that you're really committed to bettering yourself. You get out automatically. That has never made sense to me. Now, maybe it makes sense on a nonviolent crime. I'm somebody who thinks most drug crimes that don't involve violence, that's a very different fish than somebody who home invades somebody in the middle of the night at 3 a.m. and holds a gun to a child's head. Perhaps we'd be a lot better served having a parole board or parole where, look, if you get out after a third, but then you violate again, should you get out after a third on that next sentence? Maybe you should be in for 2/3. Maybe you should be in until warrant expiry. Or maybe if you keep reoffending, we have a repeat offender hearing where the public and the judiciary and lawyers like me have to go to court and say, why are we giving this person another chance when we genuinely believe they're dangerous and can't be stopped? And the Crown, just to end the answer, hasn't brought a long-term or dangerous offender application. People are sitting ducks,
Thank you, Mr.
and I
Goldstein.
use that term for Mr. Kaler,
Ms.
ticking
Latenda,
time bomb.
Over to you for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll continue with you, Mr. Goldkind. So in your view, public confidence is critical to any justice system, as you may know, but what role, in your view, should transparency and data play in helping Canadians understand how bail decisions are made and monitored?
Well, I think I understand your question, and just turning my head to it, I have been outspoken for about 15 to 20 years in my career that I do not like the publication bans that are constantly put on bail decisions where a high-profile violent person is released into the community. Now, as you know, the reason is given that it will poison or taint a jury pool. Mm-hmm. I've never bought that. I can't tell you how many days of my life I spend trying to get a mistrial with a jury, and the judge says back to me, no, juries do what they're supposed to do. They can disabuse their mind of what they don't know. So I think the public is better served by knowing why somebody is released. I do genuinely believe sunlight is the best antiseptic to educating the public, not letting Twitter do it, not letting TikTok do it, not letting a Facebook post do it, but actually letting the public read why a high-profile person is being released. That's very important. And the second part to your question is, I don't think Crown attorneys, and I know this won't be talked about here, but I feel passionately about it. I'm a criminal defense lawyer. If I have a client that doesn't get bail that I think should genuinely have been released, I bring what's called a bail review. I make very little money to do it. I ask for funding to do it, but I do it because I don't think that person should be in. The flip side is, why doesn't the Crown attorney, when there's a high-profile case and the person got bail, a gun runner, a shooter, a person out on their third bail that a judge or justice of the peace has released, why doesn't the Crown attorney, given the tools in the criminal code that exist, why doesn't the Crown attorney bring a bail review to review that decision? If that happened, I think we'd have a much better system, and that tool already exists. It's in the toolbox.
Okay. Interesting perspective. In your view, how effective are the recent targeted reforms to bail, particularly for repeat violent offenders, and what additional improvements, in your opinion, might help balance safety with judicial discretion?
I think there has to be something in the zeitgeist where judges and judicial officials, justice of the peace, don't feel as reluctant to detain people that are dangerous. There are sections in the criminal code that make it clear that justice is not blind, that the court is obliged to look at somebody's background. That often has very good reason and very proper reason. Somebody who grew up with fetal alcohol syndrome, for example, is very different than somebody who didn't. There are resource issues. The system is underfunded. But in terms of the bail system, at the end of the day, the tools are there. You know the primary ground, secondary ground, and tertiary ground. It is there to prevent somebody dangerous from being released. But in my view, because of the sections of the criminal code that are being applied in the court system, tie goes to the runner. And to use that baseball reference, I think the pendulum should swing back to public safety. And if there's a doubt that somebody is truly dangerous and cannot comply with bail, or perhaps They've had a very, very significant record over the last 5 years. That is concerning to the public that that person is getting their fifth or sixth chance.
Thank you. Ms. Owens, public debate around bail can often become polarized, as you probably witnessed as of late. So how can we ensure that future reforms stay grounded in evidence and outcomes rather than rhetoric?
Thank you very much for the question. I think one of the things that's really important is that we gather accurate data and we gather it from the various provinces and territories to get a sense of what the actual facts on the ground are. And I know Ms. Leclerc has spoken about some of the data that we do have, and I do think the data we have reflects a system that is in crisis, but not for the reason that is often publicized. It's in crisis because too many people are detained. In 2024, 76% of bails were denied. We're not seeing this frequent catch and release that is often spoken about. So I think it's bringing that data in, acknowledging the real pain that people who experience crime go through, that is real, but also going back to what the actual facts are.
The segue to Madame Leclerc. Donc, vous avez dit dans votre témoignage tout à l'heure.
Ms. Leclerc, you were rather talking about this data. How can we improve provincial data collection in order to better assess the impact of bail decisions on public safety? Very rapidly, Ms. Leclerc. Could she submit an answer in writing, Mr. Chair? Yeah, that would be better. Or someone else could pick up the question and ask the question, because now we'll go to Mr. Fortin. 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to thank all of our witnesses. We could talk about this issue for days on end. This is really high-quality testimony, so please do not hesitate to send written submissions as well. I have about 2 minutes. Ms. Leclerc, I'd like to hear your opinions on rehabilitation. After all the discussion we've had, I have to say that I believe in rehabilitation, in the presumption of innocence. We need to have the structures in place to do all that. But as it stands in our judicial system, criminal system, do we have the resources in rehabilitation and staff? Are we really rehabilitating individuals who are detained? And can we really take care of the individuals who are released? There are systems in place, but they are underfinanced. A significant part of the problem is that too many people are caught in the system. Too many people behind bars in prison who shouldn't necessarily be there. 70% of prison sentences are 6 months or shorter. So individuals in prison, we are investing a lot of time on them, and it's revolving doors at the end of the day. And we don't have a lot of time to work with them. What is done in prisons to rehabilitate prisoners? Now, the longer the sentence, the better your shot of working with these individuals with different programs in prisons and follow-up, and sentimental aspects of the issue should also be taken into account. Now, people might also have a history of victimization. This could be done in the prison setting, but we need time to do it. The Netflix sentences you referred to, what resources do we have or we don't have to take care of these individuals in these situations? I mean, there are resources in people sometimes ask their lawyers not to go for that sentence if at all possible. About 50% of people do not want this type of sentencing because they find the conditions to be too harsh. So we need to accompany them so that this is also helpful for them. Thank you very much, Mr. Clerc. I'd like to thank all of other witnesses as well.
5 minutes.
Thank you to all the witnesses for being here today. Ms. Owens, you mentioned earlier the importance of grounding what we do in data. We had the St. Thomas police chief here, and he had said at one point that 58% of intimate partner violence in St. Thomas is perpetrated by repeat offenders. Does a number like that surprise you?
No, I would say that it doesn't. I think that we see people who cause harm to others repeatedly do so, and I think the challenge that I see is that the criminal justice system doesn't interrupt that pattern of violence in a way that other services, rehabilitative services, might have a better shot at doing.
And a repeat offender, when you talk about interruption, incarceration is an interruption, correct?
Incarceration is absolutely an interruption, but in the vast majority of cases, as Ms. McVicker alluded to, a temporary interruption. So what are we doing to set victims up for safety when that person is ultimately released back into the community?
So it's temporary because people are being released back into the community, correct?
Yes, both at the end of a sentence or perhaps when they are released
or pre-trial.
On pre-trial release.
So it would actually be safer for, I'll say women, because women are the majority, sadly, of intimate partner violence victims. It would be safer if a repeat offender of intimate partner violence were still behind bars.
Perhaps in the short term, but if they don't have access to the sort of programming and rehabilitative services that they need to not reoffend, then no, you're just releasing them back into the community in the same state that they were when they went in.
Thank you very much. Mr. Goldkind, I'd like to ask you about this as a defense lawyer, and I will preface what I'm saying by pointing out that I believe strongly in the importance to our legal system and our justice system in having vigorous defense available. And I know you have an obligation to represent your clients to the fullest extent. I believe unmitigated zeal is a term I've read in legal scholarship about this. But I'll ask you, has it become easier for you to get your clients bail in the last 10 years?
Yes.
And when you are representing clients and you are trying to get them bail, you as a defense lawyer appeal to the principle of restraint, do you not?
I appeal to that and a number of other options available to me in the criminal code based on the client's background, the client's race, the client's cultural background, the client's mental health situation, the quality of the sureties, and the criminal record, amongst very much other things. But yes, bail is one of the focuses of my practice, and I have noticed that anecdotally, obviously I'm just speaking for me, in the last decade or so.
And again, your role is to represent your client. Your primary obligation as a defense lawyer is not public safety, but the system itself could be designed in a way that does prioritize public safety, correct?
That's very true. Like, you might listen to me today as you and I are talking and hear that I have one view as a citizen mixed with a criminal defense lawyer. When I walk into a courtroom, which I do every single day of my life for 20 years, there is no guesswork. It is unmitigated zeal to do the very best job I can for that client, whether you want to use more media terms in terms of a trial and getting them acquitted, or getting them out on bail, even if they've committed 17 crimes, they were out on 15 bails. This part of my life that I'm talking to you stops. And when I go into the courtroom, unmitigated zeal is a very polite way of the passion I undertake on behalf of any client who hires me. I am not as concerned in that moment with public safety or the balancing that we're here talking about today. I have one mission, and I choose to accept it.
The Liberal government, though, it sounds like from what you're saying, Mr. Goldkind, has handed defense lawyers, has handed perpetrators, a variety of tools that put public safety in jeopardy. Is that correct?
I would think that's a fair comment, but I don't want to just point the finger one way. I think this is something in the ether over the last 10, 20 years as Canada changes very much. I think there is a perception, yes, that the government of the day is perceived to be soft on crime. That's why I thought last week's announcement in advance of this committee was of significant interest to me. But there are other factors at play. I want to be fair. There is judges, justices of the peace, the cultural perception of certain things, Canada changing, the criminal code in certain sections. But yes, I think I would be being disingenuous with you if I thought we have a government sort of similar to the one south of the border that's making it clear that law and order are top of mind and crime is going to be harshly punished no matter who you are.
Thank you. I have 10 seconds left here. If we were to repeal the principle of restraint from the criminal code, would that make bail harder to get for repeat violent offenders?
I think it might in certain circumstances. I really draw the line in the 10 seconds we have on violence versus nonviolence. I'm not in favor of repealing the principle of restraint. I think it's important as a civilized country. I just think it should be applied differently to those that are not getting the message from many previous chances to get the message.
Thank you.
Mr. Goldkind. Thank you, Mr. Lawton. MP Dillon, 5 minutes.
Much. I will start with Ms. Owens. My first question to you would be, do you believe it should be harder for those repeat offenders accused of intimate partner violence to get bail?
I don't think that there is a legislative solution to the problem of gender-based violence to be found within the criminal code. I think that it's incredibly tempting for, and I say this as someone who is a lawyer, for us to look to law as the solution to these problems. But I think, as you've heard from many witnesses, the tools exist in the criminal code. It's a question of how those tools are applied, and it's a question of the supports that are provided both to people accused of crimes and to victims to ensure that they're safe. So I would say I don't think that there are changes in the criminal code that need to be made at this point.
Okay. And as you know, my next question is for Ms. Vicker. McVicker.
Yeah.
So as you know, Bill C-75, we brought that forward on intimate partner violence. There's a reverse onus that was created for bail for repeat intimate partner violence offenders, and it required courts to consider past violence. Are these the kinds of measures that you think would help victims in the long run and strengthen accountability as well?
I think it's important that you look at past history. I think it tells you a lot about what future behaviors are going to be, especially in cases of intimate partner violence. I think that's important. I know that one of the speakers talked about it, sureties. One of the things that we do when we're doing our bail notification, when we're talking to victims prior to bail court, who is a good surety? Who is not a good surety? Who do you feel is not able to do that public duty of being the bailer in the community? And I think it's important that we listen to victims in those areas, because they know the people in the offender's life, especially with intimate partner violence, and they know who might be appropriate and who isn't appropriate. And I also agree that the use of estrangement hearings would go a long ways if people found out it was going to cost them money or some other kind of consequence if they don't do their job, and make sure that they're ensuring that the offender remain on their conditions.
Okay, and just a follow-up question. The Conservative Party has promised to repeal Bill C-75, which would remove these very protections. From your perspective, would that be a mistake for those victims of intimate partner violence?
I think the conditions that are placed on bail are really important for victims. That's why bail notification is so important. We have to make sure that there's an absolute right that victims have to have a copy of those conditions of release, so they know what the offender is allowed to do and is not allowed to do, and also have the information on what to do if those conditions are violated. And that's victim empowerment.
Okay, thank you so much. Et Madame Leclerc, est-ce que vous voulez rajouter quelque chose?
Ms. Leclerc, would you like to add something on this? I fully share the opinion of my colleague. I don't have anything else to add.
Would you also agree with what Ms. McVicker has said? Or?
Yes, I would say that LEAF supported the passage of Bill C-75 and would like to see it continue to be law.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
We have now the opportunity to jump into the third round. We'll probably get through three people, starting off with Mr. Gill for 5 minutes, and then MP Maloney avec Réal pour clore le tout avec 2 minutes et demie. Mr. Gill.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, everyone, for coming today. Ms. McVicker, you testified previously that some victims are no longer reporting violent crime because they fear the suspect will be quickly released. Do you believe there has been a significant increase in these situations?
I've been doing this for 25 years. And yes, there are a lot of victims that have offenders that repeat and repeat and repeat, and they do get frustrated. They do start to feel like, what's the point, because he's just going to get out again, and the conditions are going to be the same, and he's just going to breach another time. And that's primarily, when we're talking about intimate partner violence, gender-based violence situations. And it is a concern, because, it's so important that they do report, because the more frequent they report, there's also the ladder of release, then the offender kind of moves up that ladder as well, which can be very important for holding accountability.
Okay. And what are the consequences for victims when bail decisions prioritize presumption of release over community safety?
Women are displaced from their home. They end up at a shelter, or we put them in a hotel because they're not safe to stay in their own home. We do our best to provide them with the safety support so they can remain in their own home. Even whether they're in custody, especially with intimate partner violence, or whether they're released, the offender may no longer pay child support, help to support the family. This is a big issue of concern for victims, especially if they have children and all of a sudden all their financial supports are gone. They don't have ways to support their family. It takes a while for them to go and apply for things like family benefits and those types of things. Oftentimes, especially with intimate partner violence, the offender controls all the resources, all the bank accounts, everything. Yeah. And it's a big financial burden, and that's part of the reason that they have them back in and they allow them to come back into the home, or they ask for a variance because they need that financial support back. Because it's hard to raise a family or to look after children when you have no financial resources.
Okay. Given the urgency of this issue, do you think the government's reluctance to adopt existing conservative motion is costing us valuable time and putting politics ahead of the safety of Canadians?
My personal opinion is that we need to look at what we can do better to support victims. There isn't, we have a victim's Bill of Rights, but there's no meat to that victim Bill of Rights. If it's violated, if they aren't provided information, if they aren't allowed input into the process to express their concerns, then they're put at greater risk. And that's what I see as one of the biggest downfalls of the system is the lack of victims to have an input and to have information.
Thank you. Mr. Goldkind, my next question is to you. Canadians are seeing violent crime up 55%, gun crime up 130%, extortions up 330%, much of it driven by repeat offenders on bail. Where do you draw the line between protecting rights and protecting the public?
Well, as I said in my opening remarks, and good afternoon to you, I think the balance has shifted too far one way. The public is feeling it. Most people who are in positions of elite institutions say, well, the public is wrong, or they can't see what's right in front of their eyes or their ears. I disagree with that. I think the public is on to something. I don't think it's unreasonable or harsh for a member of the public to not want to have to lock their door at night, to not want to have 7 Ring cameras and 6 security cameras. I think the balance needs to go back somewhere towards the center. And right now in the bail courts, I'll say 2 things. 1, too many people have to wait too long to get bail. That's an answer that this committee may not like. There are certain people that should be out that have to wait 2, 3, 4 days because there's no courts, there's no justices. They just wait 3, 4 days to get out, but they should have been released from the police station. Your question is about, as I believe you're asking me, somebody who's truly dangerous. And when I keep hearing the term presumed innocent, which is a fair point, it's a great talking point, there has to be a difference, and I'll end my answer perhaps here. There's a difference between somebody who's presumed innocent, where the evidence against them stinks, and it's he said, she said with no forensic evidence, and they're not going to be convicted, versus somebody who's presumed innocent but is on candid camera, on high-definition TV, waving at the camera, saying, I'm committing a crime. So it's really important at the bail stage, and I think there should be more of this talked about at the bail stage. Let's look at the strength of the Crown's case, not just on the tertiary ground, but is this person that there's a real reason to keep them in a strong Crown case versus the individual that I'm concerned about that has been in 3 nights too long and should be out.
Thank you, Mr. Goldkind.
Done?
Done, yeah.
Okay.
Mr. Maloney, 5 minutes.
Thanks, Chair. Thank you to all the witnesses for coming today. Your evidence is very helpful. Mr. Goldkind, I have some questions for you. I've sort of followed your career both from a legal perspective and a political perspective with some interest, and I thank you for being here today. So I want to talk a little bit about the principle of restraint. You said it's been around for a long time. It predates the 2019 legislation. How is your approach to dealing with the principle of restraint in a courtroom during a bail hearing any different now than it was before the legislation, if at all?
I think that's a good question. Good afternoon to you. I appreciate your kind comments. I didn't know that, so thank you. But I don't think my general courtroom approach is different. I am a bit of an attack dog. I am passionate in court. I will argue till the cows come home that somebody should be out. Oftentimes, as many criminal defense lawyers do, when you know in your heart of hearts they shouldn't. I think your question is asking me, what tools do I have more in my disposal in the last 5, 6, 7, 10 years on the
sorry,
principle?
I don't mean to interrupt. My question is really
Please
this.
do. Please do.
People are trying to say that this legislation imposed the principle of restraint on the court system, and it's made it easier to get out on bail. And what I'm hearing you say is your submissions in court, and probably that of your colleagues, hasn't changed much because it already existed. Is that fair?
I think that's fair, and the short answer is it's simply codified through Parliament what was already there.
Thank you. So it's a red herring. So you also were asked a question. You said you believe it's easier to get out on bail now in the last 10 or so years. Perhaps that is a trend, but there's lots of reasons for that. Wouldn't you agree with me?
If you suggest something, I'm happy to say yes or no. But yes, I think that's a fair proposition.
As an example, you just mentioned how people are waiting 2, 3, 4 days to get bail hearings. Also, you mentioned the fact that Crown attorneys don't often seek bail review applications. One of the problems is that the provincial system, which is who runs the criminal justice system, is under-resourced. Isn't that right?
Yes.
Okay. Have you ever met a Crown attorney who complained about having too many resources?
I've never met anybody in the system I've worked in for 2 decades that will ever come here and tell you they've got enough resources, period, full stop, end of story.
That applies to people in the penal system with respect to jails, and it applies with respect to justices of the peace and other people who are presiding over these hearings. Isn't that right?
Yes, sir.
And all of that factors into the problems we're now experiencing in the bail system. Is that fair?
I think that's fair, that everything factors in. Some things factor in more than others.
Okay. All right. Thank you. So to put all the blame in one place versus another is irresponsible. Would you agree with that too?
I would never do that because I think it would be kind of childish and intellectually dishonest. I'm all in favor of having adult conversations, but I also think those conversations should touch upon hot button or third rails, and that's something that's very important to me. As you mentioned, you do follow what I say.
I couldn't have put that better myself. Thank you. How do you, and there probably isn't data on this, but how often do Crown attorneys seek bail review applications?
So that's such a good question, and I know it's not a juicy answer, and we're tight on time. It is something that I've never understood. I see it happen the fifth of never. Maybe it's done once in a blue moon when there's so much public pressure where the person has a Bernardo adjacent name. I mean, you don't get that many names, but I can tell you for defense lawyers bring them all the time. There's a court literally dedicated to defense lawyers bringing bail reviews. I almost never see it. That's me answering for myself. And I really think the tools are there and they should be used by the Crown attorneys.
Okay. And unlike you, Crown attorneys have the resources, or at least they get paid to bring these applications. You might be doing it for free or because your legal aid certificate's been denied. My last question probably is with respect to the delay surrounding bail hearings. We've heard this from other witnesses too, the 2-3 days. Crowns will have 25 bail hearings in one day. They only get through 10, et cetera. Are there situations where bail hearings are then waived and you come to an agreement with the Crown prosecutor because it's expedient in the circumstances?
Yes, you work on something that's likely time served or something that's much shorter and sharper. I can tell you, and I know it's not parliamentary language, I go nuts when a court closes at 3:30 or tells me we won't start a bail hearing at 3:45. I literally go ballistic.
Okay, and my last question is, so those people where bail hearings are waived and they get out, they're still out on bail, and they would fall into the statistical category of people who are out on bail if they committed another crime, correct?
So maybe I misunderstood your question. Are you saying the bail hearing's waived and the Crown consents because they haven't had their bail hearing reached? That does tend to happen, but I think in fairness to my friends, the Crown attorneys, they wouldn't pull that trigger if they felt the person was dangerous. They just think they're close to the end of their sentence. So an extra day or two is not in the interest of justice to keep them in.
But it does happen, and it would fall into that category.
I'd have to say across Canada, I'd be shocked if I could tell you it doesn't happen. Of course, lawyers negotiate every day trying to do the best they can with the limited deck of cards that they have.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Monsieur Fortin, à vous 2 minutes et demie.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In 2.5 minutes, I will ask a question to Mr. Goldkind because the discussion so far has been quite interesting. Mr. Goldkind, Crown attorneys, they're not asking for revisions very frequently. Does that have to do with the fact that courts are already backlogged and they will not be able to get to these demands in due times, as underlined by the Supreme Court and the Jordan decision and others? So this backlogged situation of the courts, I mean, does that not have a role in these revision requests when it comes to bail decisions?
Well, I think it should. I think too many things are held for a bail hearing. I'm giving you a very, very natural defense lawyer answer now. Sometimes Crowns make you have a bail hearing that takes up half a day or a quarter of a day for somebody that they should have consented to that release.
Merci.
But I can tell you on the other...
Parce qu'on a seulement 2 minutes.
Thank you. I will interrupt you because I only have 2 minutes. So, in your opinion, is there a lack of funding in the judicial system? And the administration of justice, of course, is a provincial jurisdiction. But should we be transferring more money to the provinces so that they can do a better job administering their justice systems? Would that be an element that could help partly the issue, not entirely, but partly the issue before us today?
Given the time pressures we're under, I think it never hurts to have more funding. I'm somebody who thinks taxpayer dollars should be respected. But when you have the Toronto Regional Bail Centre at Finch and 400 that was created and built to do nothing but bail hearings, have 37 bail hearings in the line, and only 4 or 5 are getting done in a certain day, that to me is ridiculous. That's my answer to your question.
Merci, M. Goldkind. Dernière question. Il reste à peu près...
Thank you very much, Mr. Goldkind. Last question. Electronic means of tracking individuals, could that be a tool that could be used in bail? So I'd like to hear what you think about ankle bracelets.
It's a very important tool. Courts now are looking less favorably upon that, to your question, given the number of people cutting them off or violating them, but it is an important tool, particularly for somebody who doesn't have a surety, because you may not know this, the government, you may know this, obviously, you're the government, actually funds those, so it's not the way it was a year ago. Well, if you're not, okay, I take it back, my mistake, but you understand where I think I am.
And hopefully he never is in this country. I think he doesn't want it. He doesn't.
That's an inside joke that I don't get that inside joke, so I'll stay out of that.
It's the last thing the Bloc Québécois wants. We don't have time for a full round for the last 2 witness questioners, members. So Mr. Bebo will give you 2 minutes, and then 2 minutes for Mr. Chang.
Mr. Goldkind, in a TV appearance last week, you said that even though we haven't seen the new Liberal bill yet, you said that the new Liberal bill is probably going to be window dressing. Can you please tell us why?
Yeah, and in fairness, I think that's quite possible because it doesn't touch upon the third rails, the hot button issues that I think you have to talk about in bail. I've given some examples earlier. I think until there's a real meaningful move, that dangerousness becomes the top order of the day and the idea of harshness changes, as I've talked about, I don't think there'll be a massive change in the numbers. Now, to end my answer again, because of time pressures, the devil will be in the details. I can't answer that scientifically for the next 5-10 years. But if it were up to me to change the bail system, I'd be making some much more serious and harsh changes.
Look, I was with some Toronto police officers last weekend at an event, and a Division 31 officer told me that 5% of the criminals are responsible for 95% of the crime. What can we do specifically? What do you recommend specifically that we do by way of the criminal code to change that?
I think everything in the criminal code is there. I think there are some sections that I would have a concern about. As I said, I think justice should be blind. I think in certain circumstances, it's important to look at somebody's culture or cultural background. I think in other circumstances, it creates a multi-tiered system. The number one concern that I think the bail system should have is the balancing of somebody's right to reasonable bail with the idea that some people are just dangerous, and no matter whether mommy and daddy run to court and offer to put up their house or $5,000 or $10,000, some people are just incorrigible and they will not stop. If the public feels that way, which I think is real, it is not inappropriate for the courts to also understand that some people, whether it's the 5% that you just mentioned, 10%, 15%, some people just will not abide by court orders, and there's nothing harsh or mean-spirited about saying that.
Thank 2 minutes.
Madam Leclerc, based on your comparative research, are there lessons from other countries that Canada should consider as we continue assessing reforms?
I'm sorry, I missed the question.
Oh, no problem.
You repeat?
Yeah, so based on your research, are there any lessons from other countries that Canada should consider as we continue assessing reforms?
Oui, en fait, ce qu'on peut voir là, des comparatifs, surtout si on se compare au...
Yes, comparisons are made all the time with the United States, especially because they're when you go harsher on sentencing, you end up filling prisons and not necessarily reduce crime. So measures that are strict, minimal sentences, for instance, or consecutive sentencing, or forcing certain decisions end up having negative outcomes most of the time. I can give examples. For instance, when judges do not agree with minimum sentences, they could come up with diversion methods, and you cannot always foresee these situations, and you will end up losing people through the cracks in the system. So these issues should also be addressed. What I would say is that when you limit discretion, it can become dangerous. This reform should be done in discussion, in cooperation with the stakeholders who are faced with the realities of the system on a day-by-day basis.
Thank you.
This completes the second hour, or second and third hour. Je voulais juste prendre un moment pour vous remercier.
I just want to take a minute to thank you very much. This is very important, especially for the end of our study.
Leave on your will. Just for the benefit of members that are here, we have a budget that was circulated to you to compensate the witnesses and continue the financial support for this study. So you have, I assume there's no objection to it, but we formally need to approve it. No objections. Thank you. Yeah, excellent. There is a wish list as well of witnesses that have asked to appear. I would just encourage you before the next meeting to get back to us if you want any particular one of those witnesses on, and we'll schedule them for the next witness round. So thank you very much.
Mr. Chair, I don't mean to interrupt you. So will I be getting that response in writing from the witness?
Yes.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.